Everyone knows the Eye. The great lidless eye, wreathed in flame, searching the world from its tower in Mordor, hunting for a ring, reaching for dominion over all things. Everyone knows Sauron as the Dark Lord, the shadow in the east, the maker of the One Ring, the enemy that the entire War of the Ring was fought to defeat. He is the great villain of the story, the lurking menace, the darkness that the whole world strains against. But almost no one knows how he got there. The being we call Sauron was not born evil. He was not created as a tyrant. He did not crawl out of some dark pit already bent on domination and cruelty. The truth is stranger and more unsettling than that, because the being who would become the Dark Lord began as something close to an angel, a spirit of extraordinary gifts, admired among his peers, devoted to order and beauty and the perfecting of the world. His original name was not Sauron at all. His name was Mairon, and it meant the admirable. Tonight I want to tell you the real story of how Sauron became what he became. The long, slow fall from grace that took a spirit of light and order and turned him, step by step, choice by choice, into the most feared being in Middle-earth. Because Sauron did not become the Dark Lord overnight. He became the Dark Lord through a series of decisions, each one seemingly reasonable at the time, each one carrying him further from what he had been and closer to the thing he would become. And by the time he understood what he had lost, it was far too late to go back. This is a story about corruption. Not the sudden kind, not the dramatic villain origin kind, but the slow, creeping, almost invisible kind. The kind where you wake up one day and realize you have become something you would not recognize, and that the road to this moment was paved with convictions you still believe in. That is the horror of Sauron's story. He did not fall because he stopped caring about order and beauty and perfection. He fell because he never stopped caring about them, and because his love of those things, twisted and perverted by darkness, became the instrument of his ruin and the ruin of the world. Stay with me. The story of how Sauron became the Dark Lord is the story of how the brightest gifts can become the darkest curses, and it begins before the world was made. Part 1. Mairon the Admirable. Before we can understand how Sauron fell, we have to understand what he was before he fell, because the distance of that fall is the true measure of the tragedy. In the beginning, before the world existed, there was Eru Ilúvatar, the One, the creator of all things. And from his thought Ilúvatar brought forth the Aina, the Holy Ones, great spirits of immense power and beauty, each carrying a part of Ilúvatar's own mind. They sang the music of the Aina, the great song from which all of reality would grow, and in that singing, the world was imagined into being. Afterward, the greatest of these spirits entered the world they had helped to sing, and became the Valar and the Maia, the powers and their servants, the spiritual beings who shaped and governed creation. Mairon was a Maia, one of the lesser spirits, in rank if not in ability. He belonged to the household of Ol, the great smith, the Valar who loved craft and making, who delighted in the substances of the world and in the shaping of them into things of beauty and use. Ol's domain was the stuff of creation itself, stone, metal, earth, the deep things, the things you could shape with skill and will into something finer than they had been. And Mairon was among the most gifted of all his servants. What we know of Mairon's nature before his fall tells us something vital. He loved order. He loved the perfecting of things, the vision of a world running smoothly, every part in its proper place, every element arranged according to a design of maximum efficiency and beauty. He was not drawn to chaos or destruction. He was drawn to the opposite, to harmony, precision, the satisfaction of a thing well made and a system that works without flaw. His gifts were enormous: craft, intelligence, the ability to organize and to plan, and they were all pointed toward this single burning desire to see the world perfected, ordered, made whole. Think about that for a moment. The being who would become the Dark Lord started with a love of perfection, not of cruelty, not of domination, not of suffering. Perfection, the desire to see things working properly, arranged beautifully, functioning without waste or error. And if you think that sounds like an unlikely beginning for a villain, if you think there must be something wrong with the account, some hidden flaw we're not being told about, then you are very close to understanding why Sauron's story is so terrifying. Because the flaw was not hidden. The flaw was the virtue itself, carried past its proper limit, taken beyond the boundary where love of order becomes the will to impose order on everything, whether it consents or not. That is the seed. That is where it all begins. Not with a desire for evil, but with a desire for good. A desire so intense, so consuming, so impatient with imperfection, that it could not tolerate the freedom of others to be imperfect. And the being who would teach Myron how to turn that desire into a weapon of domination was already waiting. Part 2. The shadow that sang out of tune. To understand how Meryn fell, you have to understand the one who caught him, the first and greatest of all fallen things, the shadow against which all other shadows are measured. You have to understand Melkor. Melkor was the mightiest of all the Ainur. He possessed, according to the law, a share of the gifts of all the other great spirits, a portion of every power, every domain, every capacity. He was the most powerful single being that Ilúvatar ever created, and that power was his glory and his doom. Because Melkor, alone among the Ainur, grew restless with his place. He wanted more. He went out into the void, searching for the flame imperishable, the creative fire that belongs to Ilúvatar alone, the power to create true life from nothing. He did not find it, because it was not out there to be found. It was with Ilúvatar always. But the searching changed him. In the emptiness of the void, thoughts arose in Melkor that were different from the thoughts of the other Ainur. Thoughts born of his own pride and his own frustration. Thoughts that had no part in the vision of Ilúvatar. And when the time came for the great music, when the Ainur gathered to sing the themes of Ilúvatar and weave the song from which the world would grow, Melkor wove his own themes into the harmony. Discordant themes. Themes of his own devising, sprung from his trips into the void, clashing with the music of the others, trying to overwhelm and dominate the song. This was the first act of rebellion in all of creation, the first discord, the first assertion of a will that refused to harmonize and insisted instead on mastering everything it touched. Now, why does this matter for Myron? Because Melkor's discord was not random noise. It had a quality to it, a terrible attractiveness. Melkor was brilliant, the mightiest of all, and his rebellion was not mindless but purposeful. It was the assertion of a vision, a counter-vision, a different way of ordering the world. Melkor wanted to impose his will on creation, to shape it according to his own design rather than the design of Ilúvatar. And for a spirit like Myron, a spirit who already burned with the desire to see the world perfected, who was already impatient with disorder and waste and the slow, messy freedom of things left to grow as they would, Melkor's vision had a seductive logic. Here was a being of unmatched power, offering a vision of the world brought to order, shaped by a single commanding will, perfected through domination. Melkor promised results. He promised efficiency. He promised that the world could be made to work as it should, if only a strong enough hand held the reins. And Myron, who wanted so badly to see the world perfected, who chafed at the slow and gentle methods of the Valar, who hungered for a faster and more forceful path to the order he loved, Myron listened, and something in what Melkor offered spoke to the hunger in him. Part 3. Why Meryn turned. Let us be very careful here, because this is the hinge of the whole story, and getting it right means understanding something uncomfortable about how corruption actually works. Meryn did not join Melkor because he wanted to be evil. He did not wake up one morning and decide, I shall serve the darkness. That is not how falls work, not in Tolkien's world, and not, I think, in ours. Meryn turned to Melkor because Melkor offered him the fulfillment of his own values. Melkor was, in those early days, still wearing a fair disguise, not the ruined, spiteful Dark Lord he would later become, but a mighty spirit of immense charisma and vision, who presented himself as someone who simply wanted to get things done, to bring the world to its proper shape, to cut through the delays and the disagreements and the patient, plodding processes of the Valar and impose a grand design. And Mairon, looking at Melkor and looking at the Valar, saw a contrast that seemed persuasive. The Valar were patient. They worked slowly, carefully in cooperation with one another and with the freedom of the world. They did not impose. They nurtured, guided, waited. Their way of ordering the world was gentle and organic, and, to a spirit burning with the desire for perfection, agonizingly slow. Things grew at their own pace. Creatures made their own choices, even bad ones. The world was messy, imperfect, full of the kind of disorder that drove a being like Mairon half-mad with frustration. Melkor offered an alternative. His vision was not patience and cooperation, but command and control. Under Melkor, the world would be shaped by a will, forcibly, efficiently, without the clutter and the waste of free things stumbling about on their own. The trains would run on time, so to speak. The chaos would be cleared away. Everything would be brought into line. And for Mairon, who loved order above all things, who hated waste and imperfection, who wanted nothing more than to see the world running as smoothly and beautifully as a perfect machine, this was irresistible. Not because he wanted to serve evil, but because he wanted order, and Melkor seemed to offer the fastest route to it. This is the terrible genius of Tolkien's portrayal of Sauron's origin. Mairon was not deceived in the crude sense. He was not tricked into serving a cause he would have rejected if he had understood it. He was drawn to Melkor's vision, because that vision genuinely appealed to something real and powerful in his own nature. His fall was not a mistake. It was a choice made for reasons that, from a certain angle, looked completely reasonable. He chose efficiency over patience, command over cooperation, the imposed order over the grown one. And in making that choice, he crossed a line that he would never fully come back from. Because the difference between the order of the Valar and the order of Melkor is the difference between a garden and a prison. A garden has order, rows and seasons and patterns and designs, but the things in it are alive and growing freely, each according to its nature. A prison has order too, perfect order, everything in its place, nothing moving without permission. But the things in it are captive, controlled, denied their freedom. Mairon wanted a garden, perhaps, but the tools Melkor offered could only build prisons. And by the time Mairon understood that distinction, he was already building them. Part 4. The Lieutenant of Darkness. Once Meryn committed to Melkor's service, his enormous gifts were bent entirely toward the purposes of the first Dark Lord. And the being who had once been admired for his craft and his love of order became, over the long ages of the world, one of the most feared and hated figures in all of Middle-earth, though in a different way from his master. Melkor was chaos masquerading as order. Despite his promises, the first Dark Lord was ultimately destructive. He wanted to ruin what he could not possess, to mar what he could not control, to burn and break and spoil. His was a jealous, spiteful malice, the rage of a being who wanted to be the creator and could not be, and who therefore set himself to destroy what the true creator had made. Melkor's evil was hot, passionate, ruinous. The evil of the wrecking ball and the fire and the scream. But Mairon was different. Even in Melkor's service, Mairon retained his love of order, his gift for organization, his talent for making things work. Where Melkor destroyed, Mairon organized the destruction. Where Melkor raged, Mairon planned. Where Melkor was the storm, Mairon was the cold wind that directed it. He became Melkor's chief lieutenant, the architect of the Dark Lord's strategies, the one who kept the machinery of evil running smoothly, the armies provisioned, the fortresses designed, the campaigns coordinated, the orcs and beasts and dark creatures organized into something like an effective fighting force. In the language of the elves, who encountered him in this guise, he became known as Gorthor, the cruel, the dread abomination. He was a master of werewolves and dark sorcery, a shapeshifter who could wear any form. He held the Tower of Tol in Morgoth, the Isle of Werewolves, and from it he spread terror across the lands. In the wars of the First Age, it was often Sauron who was the more effective servant of evil, because his intelligence and his capacity for organization made him dangerous in ways that Melkor's raw destructive power alone could never be. But pay attention to what is happening beneath the surface. Because even as Mairon served Melkor faithfully, something was changing in him that would matter enormously later. Mairon was learning. He was watching his master's methods, studying the tools of domination, absorbing the techniques of fear and control, but he was also, quietly, beginning to see his master's weaknesses. Melkor was wasteful. Melkor was self-defeating. Melkor poured his power into the world and diminished himself, spreading his malice so wide that it became thin, dispersing his might into everything and leaving himself weaker with each age. Melkor was, for all his vast power, a poor strategist of his own resources, too consumed by hatred and jealousy to play the long game, too invested in petty acts of spite to conserve his strength for the victories that mattered. Mairon noticed, and he filed the observation away. Because even as he served, some part of him was already thinking about what he would do differently if the power were his. Not out of disloyalty, perhaps, not at first, simply out of the cold, orderly, perfectionist assessment that was his nature. Mairon could see the flaws in his master's approach. He could see how domination could be done better, more efficiently, more completely. And that knowledge would shape everything he did when, at last, the chance came for him to be the master instead of the servant. Part 4.5. The Isle of Werewolves. Before we leave the First Age, we should look at the moment that tells us most about what Sauron had become by this point. His hold on the Isle of Tol in Morgoth, and his confrontation with two of the great heroes of the Elder Days, Finrod Felagund, the noble elven king, and Elthian, the most beautiful of all the children of Ilúvatar. Sauron had taken the Tower of Minas Tirith, not the White City of the later ages, but an earlier tower built by Finrod himself, and turned it into the Isle of Werewolves, a place of dread and dark sorcery, from which he commanded the pass of Sirion and terrorized the western lands. It was a fortress of fear, and from it Sauron sent out his wolves and his shadows, extending Morgoth's dominion through the valleys and the passes. When Finrod came to the isle with Beren, on the desperate quest for the Silmaril that would shake the foundations of the First Age, Sauron challenged them, and the challenge took a form that tells us everything about what Sauron's power actually was. It was not a sword fight. It was not a siege. It was a duel of songs, of power against power, expressed through music and will. Finrod sang songs of strength and resistance, of the beauty of the elves and the freedom of the world. Sauron answered with songs of betrayal, of treachery, of the dark deeds that stained elven history. Back and forth the contest went, each one reaching into the other's deepest strengths and weaknesses, each one trying to overmaster the other through the sheer force of their being expressed in song. And Sauron won. He broke Finrod. The noble king fell, his power shattered, his disguise stripped away, his companions revealed and cast into the dungeons. It was a victory of dark will over noble will, of Sauron's cold, relentless, dominating force against the brave, but ultimately overmatched strength of an elven king. Finrod would later die in those dungeons, killed by a wolf, giving his life to save Beren, a sacrifice that Sauron would not have understood then and would never understand. But it was Luthien who came after, and Luthien who brought Sauron low. She came with Huan, the great wolfhound of Valinor, and she faced Sauron at his own gates, and she cast him down. Sauron shifted shape desperately, from werewolf to serpent to his own accursed form. But Huan held him fast, and Lelthien's power, the power of beauty and love and a will unbroken by fear, stripped his defenses away. Sauron yielded. He surrendered the isle, gave up his tower, and fled in the shape of a great vampire, a dark cloud across the moon, to his master's fortress, defeated and humiliated. It was one of the few times in his long career that Sauron was outright beaten in a personal confrontation. And the being who beat him was not a great warrior or a mighty lord of power. It was a maiden who loved someone enough to face the darkness for his sake, armed with nothing but her beauty and her will, and the grace that flowed through her from sources Sauron could neither understand nor withstand. Even in the First Age, Sauron was already being defeated by the things he could not comprehend. By love, by sacrifice, by a courage that did not seek power but served it in the service of another. The pattern was already there, waiting to repeat itself across the long ages, all the way to a hobbit on the slopes of Mount Doom. Part 5. The Fall of the First Dark Lord. The First Age ended in catastrophe. Melkor's power, vast as it was, could not withstand the combined might of the Valar when they at last roused themselves to intervene. The host of the West came to Middle-earth, and the War of Wrath was fought, and the devastation was so great that entire lands were broken and drowned beneath the sea. Melkor was defeated, captured, and cast out through the door of night into the void beyond the world, imprisoned forever, or until the world's end, beyond the reach of all things. And Sauron was left behind. This is one of those moments that does not get enough attention, because it reveals something crucial about who Sauron truly was, even then. When the host of the Valar came and overthrew Melkor, many of the Dark Lord's servants were destroyed or captured. But Sauron, intelligent, adaptable, always the survivor, put on a fair form, approached the herald of the Valar, and pleaded for mercy. He expressed repentance. He said he was sorry for what he had done. He asked to be forgiven. Now, was this genuine? Tolkien suggests that it may have been, at least in part. There is a reading of Sauron's repentance at the end of the First Age that says he was genuinely shaken by Melkor's defeat, genuinely afraid, and that some part of him, the part that remembered being Mairon, that remembered the love of order and beauty and the desire to be admirable, did feel something like true remorse. He had served a monster, and the monster had been thrown down, and looking at the wreckage of everything he had helped to build, some flicker of the being he had once been may have stirred. But it was not enough. And the reason it was not enough tells us everything about the nature of Sauron's corruption. The Valar's herald told Sauron that he would have to return to Valinor and face judgment, to humble himself before the Valar, to accept whatever penance they imposed, to submit his will to theirs and be healed. And Sauron could not do it. He could not submit. He could not humble himself, could not accept being judged, could not bear the thought of giving up his own will and placing himself under the authority of others. His pride, not his malice, not his cruelty, but his pride, his unshakable belief in his own judgment and his own right to order things as he saw fit, would not allow it. And so he fled. He hid himself in Middle-earth, and the moment of possible redemption passed, and the door that had stood briefly open closed behind him. This is, I think, the single most important moment in the entire history of Sauron. Everything that comes after, the Rings of Power, the fall of Menor, the War of the Ring, all of it flows from this one decision: Sauron's refusal to humble himself, his inability to submit to judgment, his choice to remain free and corrupted rather than submit to a healing that would cost him his autonomy. It was the same choice, at its root, that had drawn him to Melkor in the first place. The refusal to serve, the insistence on his own will, the conviction that he knew best, that his way was the right way, that submitting to anyone else's judgment was beneath him. Pride, not cruelty, not hatred, not the simple desire to do evil. Pride was the engine of Sauron's fall, and pride was the wall that kept him from coming back. He might have been saved at that moment. He chose not to be, and the choice was made not from strength but from the inability to bear the weakness that redemption would have required. Part 6. The freedom that terrified him. After the fall of Melkor, Sauron was alone in Middle-earth for the first time. And this, I believe, was the period that truly made him what he would become. Because without Melkor, without a master to serve, without the structure of someone else's dark vision to organize and perfect, Sauron had to confront something that he had never faced before: freedom. Think about what the world looked like to Sauron at the dawn of the Second Age. Middle-earth was a mess. The lands had been broken and reshaped by the War of Wrath. Peoples were scattered, leaderless, rebuilding. The Valar had withdrawn to the west. The great elven kingdoms of the First Age were destroyed or diminished. Everywhere Sauron looked, he saw disorder, exactly the thing he had always hated most. The chaos and the waste and the stumbling imperfection of free beings left to their own devices. And somewhere in the cold, calculating heart of the being who had once been Mairon, a thought began to form. Not I will serve another Dark Lord. Not even I will become a Dark Lord myself, perhaps. At least, not at first. The thought was more like, someone needs to fix this. Someone needs to bring order to this chaos, to organize these scattered peoples, to put the world right. And who is better qualified than Sauron, who understands order as few others do, who has the intelligence and the craft and the will to impose shape upon the shapeless. The Valar have withdrawn. Melkor is gone. There is no one left with the vision and the power to set things right. No one but him. This is the terrible logic of Sauron's self-justification, and it is the engine of his entire career as the Dark Lord. He did not think of himself as evil. He thought of himself as necessary. He was the one who could bring order, who could organize the world, who could make things work. And if his methods were harsh, if they involved domination, control, the overriding of other wills, well, that was the price of getting things done. The free peoples could not be trusted to order themselves. They were too small, too foolish, too prone to waste and error and the endless messy chaos of freedom. They needed to be managed. Governed, controlled, and Sauron was the one to do it. Do you hear the echo of Melkor in this? The same offer that Melkor made to Mairon: order through control, perfection through domination. Sauron was now making to himself. He had become his own tempter, his own Melkor, repeating the same seductive logic that had first drawn him into the dark. But there was a difference, and it is an important one. Melkor wanted to destroy what he could not possess. Sauron genuinely wanted to build, to organize, to order, to shape a world that ran according to his design. He was not, at his core, a destroyer. He was a builder who had forgotten how to build without forcing, a maker who could no longer make without controlling, an organizer whose love of order had curdled into a hunger for total command. And freedom, the freedom of others to choose, to disagree, to be imperfect, to stumble and fail and find their own way, freedom was the thing that terrified him most. Because freedom was disorder, freedom was waste, freedom was the enemy of perfection. And Sauron, who could not bear imperfection, who could not tolerate a world that would not conform to his vision, set himself to eliminate freedom from Middle-earth as thoroughly and as permanently as he could. Part 7. The Fairest Disguise. What happened next is one of the most chilling chapters in all of Tolkien's history, and it reveals a dimension of Sauron that the movies barely hint at. Because Sauron did not march into the Second Age as a flaming eye atop a dark tower, wreathed in shadow and terror. He came as a gift-giver. He came wearing beauty. He came offering help. Around the year 1200 of the Second Age, centuries after the fall of Melkor, Sauron began to approach the elves. He took a fair form, a form of beauty and grace, and he called himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. He presented himself as an emissary of the Valar, a benevolent spirit who wished only to help the elves of Middle-earth achieve their full potential. He came with flattery, with knowledge, with the offer of collaboration. He wanted, he said, to help them make things, to share his vast craft knowledge with them, to teach them secrets of making that they had never known, to help them create works of wonder that would rival the greatest achievements of the past. Some of the elves were suspicious. Gil-galad, the High King, refused him. Elrond distrusted him. But others, particularly the elven smiths of Eregion, led by the brilliant and ambitious Celebrimbor, grandson of the great craftsman Fëanor, were drawn to what Annatar offered. And who can blame them? Here was a being of immense knowledge, offering to share that knowledge freely, to help them make beautiful things, to elevate their craft to heights they could not reach alone. The elves of Eregion were makers, artists, craftsmen. They burned with the same love of making that Myron himself had once possessed, and the lure of greater making was almost impossible for them to resist. And Sauron taught them. He taught them secrets of craft, of metalwork, of the binding of power into objects. He worked alongside them, guided them, shared his knowledge. And under his tutelage, the elven smiths of Eregion created the rings of power, the great rings, objects of immense craft and might, into which the makers poured their own being and their own vision. The rings were made for good purposes, to preserve, to heal, to resist the fading of the world, to hold back the decay of time. They were, in the intention of their makers, acts of love, sub-creation of the highest order, craft in the service of beauty and preservation. But the whole time, Sauron was playing a longer game. He had taught the elves the techniques that went into the rings. He had helped to design them. He had woven his knowledge into their making. And while the elves laboured in Eregion, Sauron withdrew in secret to the fires of Mount Doom, and there, alone, he forged the One Ring, the Master Ring, the ring to rule them all, into which he poured a great part of his own being, his own will, his own power. The One Ring was designed for a single purpose, to dominate the wills of all the other ring-bearers, to control them through their rings, to make every one of them, unknowing, a servant of Sauron's will. This is Sauron at his most terrifying, not the Dark Lord of brute force and armies, but the master deceiver, the gift-giver who poisons what he gives, the teacher who weaponizes what he teaches. He did not conquer the elves by force. He offered them what they wanted most: knowledge, craft, the tools to fulfill their own desires, and in accepting his gifts, they gave him a path into their hearts and their wills. The rings of power were designed from the beginning as instruments of domination. Every ring was a leash, and the One Ring was the hand that held them all. Part 8. The One Ring and what it cost him. The forging of the One Ring is one of the most consequential acts in the entire history of Middle-earth, and understanding what Sauron actually did, what it meant, what it cost, is essential to understanding the being he became. Let me be precise about this, because it matters. When Sauron forged the One Ring, he did something that no being of his order had ever done in quite the same way. He poured a great part of his own native power, his will, his spirit, the very substance of his being, out of himself and into an object. He externalized his soul, in a sense. He took the power that was woven into his very nature, as a Maia, and he bound it into a circle of gold, creating an object that was, in effect, a portable vessel for a portion of his own spirit. Why? Because the One Ring's purpose, the domination of all other wills through their rings, required a staggering amount of spiritual force. It had to be strong enough to reach across distances, to grip the wills of elven lords and dwarf kings and mortal men, to overpower spirits of great strength and ancient wisdom. No ordinary working of power could accomplish that. Only by binding a vast portion of his own being into the ring could Sauron create an instrument of domination potent enough to control the other ring-bearers. The One Ring's power is Sauron's power, literally a piece of the Dark Lord himself, made tangible, made wearable, made terrifyingly portable. And this had consequences that Sauron accepted but perhaps never fully reckoned with. By putting so much of himself into the ring, he bound his fate to it. As long as the ring existed, Sauron could never be truly destroyed. But if the ring were destroyed, that part of him would be destroyed with it, and he would be so diminished that he could never again take shape or wield significant power in the world. The ring was his strength and his vulnerability, his weapon and his weakness, his greatest triumph and the seed of his potential doom, all bound together inseparable, in a single circle of gold. There is an irony coiled inside this that cuts to the very heart of who Sauron was. Remember, Sauron watched Melkor pour his power into the substance of the world and diminish himself by doing so, and he had judged his master a fool for it. Sauron was supposed to be the efficient one, the smart one, the one who would not make his predecessors' mistakes, and yet here he was, doing exactly what Melkor had done, externalizing his power, placing it outside himself, binding his fate to something that could be taken from him. He made the same error he had diagnosed in his master, because the hunger for domination demanded it. The desire to control everything required him to risk everything. He could not dominate without the ring, and he could not make the ring without splitting his own soul. This is the trap built into the will to dominate. It always demands more than you can safely give. It always requires you to overextend, to commit more than you can afford, to place your power where it can be taken from you. Sauron's whole career was defined by the pursuit of total control, and the One Ring was the ultimate expression of that pursuit, and it was also the ultimate vulnerability, the crack in his armor, the one thing in all the world that could undo him. The master of domination was mastered by his own instrument. The builder of prisons built one around himself. Part 9. The moment the elves heard the voice. The forging of the One Ring produced one of the most dramatic moments in the hidden history of Middle-earth, a moment that almost no one talks about. But that changed everything. The moment Sauron put the One Ring on his finger and spoke the words of binding, the elves who wore the three rings heard him. They felt his presence reaching through the rings toward their minds, felt his will groping for control over theirs, felt the sudden terrible truth of what Anatar had really been and what the rings were really for. And in that instant, they took off their rings. They removed them immediately, severing the connection, cutting the link before Sauron's domination could take hold. The elves, Galadriel, Gil-galad, Círdan, the bearers of the three, understood in a flash of horrified clarity what had been done to them. And they refused it. This is an astonishing moment, and it deserves to land with its full weight. The entire plan, the centuries of deception, the patient teaching, the careful seduction, the forging of the rings, all of it depended on the ring-bearers not knowing what was happening until it was too late. And it failed. At the critical instant, the elves felt Sauron's hand closing and pulled free. The three rings, the greatest of the elven rings, were never worn while Sauron held the one. They were hidden, guarded, kept safe against the day when the One Ring might be lost or destroyed, and the three could be used freely. The trap snapped shut on empty air. Sauron's rage at this failure was immense, and it launched the first great war of the Second Age. He assembled his armies, marched on Eregion, and destroyed it utterly. Celebrimbor, the greatest elven smith of the age, was killed, and his body was used as a banner by Sauron's forces, a horror that tells you everything about the fury of a being whose patient, elegant plan had been thwarted at the last moment. Sauron recovered most of the lesser rings, the 7 and the 9, and distributed them according to his design, giving them to dwarf lords and to mortal men, continuing his strategy of domination through gifts even after the elves had slipped through his fingers. But the elves' escape marked a turning point. Sauron had revealed himself. The disguise of Anatar was burned away, and the peoples of Middle-earth now knew what he was, not a gift-giver, but a tyrant, not a teacher, but a deceiver, not a servant of the Valar, but a lord of darkness. From this point forward, Sauron would have to rely increasingly on force rather than deception, on armies rather than seduction, on the crude tools of conquest rather than the subtle tools of manipulation. The fair mask was off, and it would never fit again quite as well, though Sauron would wear other fair faces before the end. Part 10. The 9 Who Fell. Of all Sauron's victims, the Nazgul are perhaps the most terrible, not because of what they did, but because of what they were before he found them. They were kings of men, lords, warriors, sorcerers, some of them. Great men, in their own ways, powerful and proud. And Sauron gave each of them a ring of power, and with that ring came gifts that seemed magnificent: long life, extended far beyond mortal span, knowledge, power, the ability to work wonders, a stature and a might that set them above all other mortals. For a time, they were glorious. And then the rings took them. The process was slow, like so much of Sauron's evil. The rings gave power, but they also fed on the bearers, stretching their lives unnaturally long, thinning their beings, pulling them gradually out of the visible world and into the wraith world, the shadowy realm of the unseen. One by one, the 9 kings faded, not dying exactly, but losing their substance, their bodies becoming transparent, their wills becoming bound to the One Ring and the will of its maker. They became wraiths, shadows of the men they had been, sustained only by the rings that enslaved them and the dark will that commanded them. They forgot their own names. They forgot their own faces. They became nothing but instruments of Sauron's will. The Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, the most terrible servants the Dark Lord ever possessed. Think about what this actually represents, because it is the perfect expression of Sauron's vision of order taken to its hideous conclusion. The Nazgul are beings who have been perfectly dominated. Their wills are not their own. They act, think, and exist solely in service to their master. There is no rebellion in them, no independence, no freedom, just perfect obedience, perfect service, the will of one being imposed absolutely on 9 others. In the Nazgul, Sauron achieved what he always wanted: perfect control. And the result is a horror beyond imagining. Beings stripped of everything that makes a person, hollow shells animated by another's will, condemned to an existence that is neither life nor death, but something far worse than either. This is the truth about Sauron's vision of order, laid bare in the fate of his most intimate servants. The perfection he seeks is the perfection of the prison. The order he loves is the order of the enslaved. When he says he wants to set the world right, what he means is that he wants to do to the world what he did to the 9, to dominate every will, to hollow out every person, to make all things extensions of his own will with no independent existence of their own. The Nazgul are not just servants. They are a prophecy, a preview of what Sauron wants for all of Middle-earth, a world of wraiths, a world of slaves, a world in which there is only one will, his, and everything else is merely an extension of it. Part 11. The Patience of Evil. One of the things that makes Sauron so different from most villains, and so much more frightening, is his patience. He is not a being who acts in haste. He plays the longest of long games, planning across centuries, building slowly, accepting temporary setbacks with a cold equanimity that is terrifying precisely because it is so calculating. Consider the scope of his planning with the Rings of Power. He spent centuries, literal centuries, cultivating the elves of a region. He learned their ways, won their trust, taught them his craft, guided the making of the rings, and only then, when everything was in position, did he forge the One Ring and spring the trap. This is not the behavior of a raging monster. This is the behavior of a mind of extraordinary intelligence and discipline, capable of deferring gratification for hundreds of years in pursuit of a single overarching goal. Sauron could wait, because Sauron understood that true domination, the kind that lasts, the kind that cannot be easily overthrown, requires patience, subtlety, and the willingness to lay foundations that may not bear fruit for generations. And when his plan failed, when the elves heard his voice and removed their rings, Sauron did not despair. He adapted. He shifted to force, conquered Eregion, recovered the 7 and the 9, and redistributed them to dwarves and men. When the dwarves proved resistant to domination through the rings, their stubborn natures and their creation by all making them difficult to enslave outright, Sauron accepted that partial failure too, and focused his attention on the men, who proved more susceptible. He adjusted, recalibrated, tried different approaches. He was never wedded to a single plan so rigidly that he could not abandon it when circumstances changed. He was, in short, an excellent strategist, cold, flexible, adaptive, always keeping the long goal in view while changing the methods as needed. This patience is itself a form of his original corruption made practical. Remember what Mehron loved: order, efficiency, the long view, the well-designed system. In Sauron the Dark Lord, those qualities became instruments of evil, but they were still, at their root, the same qualities. His patience was the patience of the organizer, the system builder, the engineer who understands that great works take time. And that made him far more dangerous than a being of mere fury and chaos would have been. A raging monster can be defeated in a single battle. A patient, calculating, adaptive mind that plans across centuries and learns from every failure, that is an enemy of a different and far more dangerous order. Part 12. The Island Kingdom. And then came Menna, and with Menor came the most audacious, the most cunning, and the most successful act of destruction that Sauron ever accomplished. The overthrow of the greatest civilization of men that ever existed, achieved not by force of arms, but by the sheer power of his mind and his tongue. Menor was the great island kingdom of the Nadain, the men of the West, given to them by the Valar as a reward for their loyalty in the wars against Morgoth. It was a land of wonders, the mightiest realm of mortal men in all of history, blessed with long life, great knowledge, and power that rivaled even the elves. At the height of its glory, Menor was so powerful that its fleets ruled the seas, its armies were unmatched, and its king, Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, was the mightiest mortal monarch the world had ever seen. And when Ar-Pharazôn came to Middle-earth with the full might of Menor's host, an army so vast and so terrifying that Sauron's own servants fled at the sight of it, Sauron did something unexpected. He surrendered. He came down from his dark tower, and he knelt before Ar-Pharazôn, and he let himself be taken prisoner, carried back to Menor in chains, a captive of the very king he intended to destroy. Because Sauron understood something that Ar-Pharazôn did not. He understood that the greatest fortress can be taken from within, that the mightiest kingdom is most vulnerable to the enemy it invites through its own gates, and that a being of his intelligence and persuasive power, placed at the heart of Mena's court, could do more damage than any army. He surrendered because surrender was the weapon. Captivity was the strategy. He let himself be taken to Menor because Menor was where he wanted to be. And once there, he went to work. Within a few years, just years, not centuries this time, because the men of Menor were more susceptible than the elves had been, Sauron had transformed himself from prisoner to advisor to high priest. He played on the Inmenraians' greatest fear, death. These were men who had been given longer lives than any other mortals, and who had come over the centuries to resent the one thing they could not have, immortality. They lived 300 years, and burned with envy of the elves, who lived forever. And Sauron, with his silver tongue and his ancient cunning, found that fear and cracked it wide open. He turned the Inmenrians against the Valar. He introduced the worship of Morgoth. He built a great temple in which human sacrifices were offered to the dark. He whispered to Ar-Pharazôn that the undying lands of the West, the blessed realm of the Valar, where the elves dwelt in deathless bliss, could be seized, that their immortality could be taken by force, that the ban against mortals sailing west was nothing but the jealousy of the Valar, trying to keep men from the gift that was rightfully theirs. And Ar-Pharazôn, proud and desperate and afraid of his own approaching death, believed him. The king built the greatest fleet in the history of the world and sailed west against the undying lands. And Ilúvatar himself intervened. The world was changed, reshaped, bent into a sphere so that mortals could never again sail to the west by any road. Menor was drowned beneath the waves, destroyed utterly, sunk beneath the sea with all its glory and all its people. The greatest civilization of men, wiped from the earth in a single cataclysm. And Sauron, who had engineered it all, who had turned the mightiest kingdom of men against the very powers that had blessed it, Sauron was caught in the destruction. his fair body destroyed in the drowning of the island. But he did not die. He was a Maia, a spirit, and though his body was ruined, his spirit survived, fled back to Middle-earth, returned to Mordor, and began again. But something was lost in the drowning of Menor that Sauron could never recover. He lost the ability to take a fair form. Never again could he wear the beautiful disguise, the shape of Anatar, the face of the gift-giver. From this point forward, Sauron could only appear as a thing of terror, dark, terrible. A lord of shadow and dread. The beautiful mask was gone forever, burned away in the destruction of Menor, and with it went his subtlest and most dangerous weapon, the ability to seduce. Part 12 and a half. The masterpiece of manipulation. I want to dwell on the fall of Menor a moment longer, because it is Sauron's single most impressive achievement, and examining how he did it reveals the full extent of his psychological genius and the full depth of his corruption. Consider the position he started from. He was a prisoner, a captive, brought in chains to the mightiest kingdom of men that ever existed, surrounded by an army that could have crushed him, stripped of his power base, his armies, his fortress, everything from that position. From rock bottom, from absolute vulnerability, he worked his way to becoming the most powerful person in Menor within a handful of years, not decades, not centuries as he had taken with the elves. Years, the speed of it is staggering, and it tells us something both about his ability and about the weakness he exploited. The weakness was mortality. The Inmenrians had been given longer lives than any other men, 3 times the normal span or more, and they had come across the centuries to resent the one gift they could not have, immortality. They lived 300 years and looked west at the undying lands where the elves lived forever, and the resentment curdled in them. They had everything a mortal people could want: wealth, power, beauty, knowledge, long life, and it was not enough, because they were still going to die. Sauron found that wound and drove a blade into it. He told them that the ban against sailing west was not a law of nature, but a rule imposed by the Valar out of jealousy, to keep men from the gift of deathlessness. He told them that the Valar feared men's power, that they were deliberately withholding the gift of immortality to keep men subordinate. He spun a story in which the Menrians were not the blessed recipients of extraordinary favor, but the victims of a cosmic injustice. A people denied what was rightfully theirs by jealous gods who feared what men might become if given the same gifts as the elves. It was a brilliant lie, precisely calibrated to its audience. Ar-Pharazôn was already proud, already resentful of mortality, already chafing at the limits placed on him. Sauron gave that pride a story to justify itself, a narrative in which defiance of the Valar was not rebellion but justice, not hubris but the rightful claiming of what had been unfairly withheld. And piece by piece, year by year, Sauron dismantled everything that had made Menor great: its reverence for the Valar, its friendship with the elves, its moral foundations, and replaced it all with a cult of Morgoth, a religion of death and fire, and the desperate, mad pursuit of immortality through conquest. The result was the greatest catastrophe in the history of men. And Sauron achieved it not with armies, not with rings, not with any weapon but his voice and his understanding of what makes powerful people vulnerable. He found the one thing the Inmenrians could not accept about themselves: their mortality, and he used it to destroy them. He turned their greatest fear into their fatal weakness, their pride into the instrument of their ruin, their defiance of death into the cause of death for an entire civilization. That is the Sauron who frightens me most. Not the Dark Lord on his throne, the counselor at the king's ear, the voice that finds the crack in your soul and whispers through it, the intelligence that understands your weakness better than you understand it yourself, and that can, from the position of a prisoner in chains, bring down the mightiest kingdom in the world without drawing a sword. Part 13. The Lord of Mordor. After the drowning of Menor, Sauron returned to Mordor, and this is when he became fully and finally the Dark Lord as we know him. No more fair disguises, no more patient seductions, No more centuries spent cultivating trust. The being who returned from the ruin of Menor was stripped of his subtlety and left with his other great tools: force, fear, and the One Ring. And yet, even diminished, even reduced, even without his fair form and the ability to deceive as he once had, Sauron was extraordinarily dangerous. Because the fundamental qualities that had made him formidable were still intact. His intelligence was undiminished. His will was as iron as ever. His capacity for organization, for long-term planning, for the patient building of power through the careful construction of systems, all of this remained. He was still, at his core, the great organizer, the master builder, the being who could take chaos and forge it into order, even if the order he built was a prison. He rebuilt Barad Dûchtur, the Dark Tower, raising it again from its foundations. He gathered his servants, the Nazgul, the Orcs, the dark men of the east and south whom he had long cultivated, the fell beasts and the creatures of shadow. He stretched his hand over the lands of Middle-earth, and the shadow grew. And he began the long preparation for the final war. The war that would give him dominion over all of Middle-earth. The war that would fulfill the vision he had carried since the days of Mairon, a world ordered, controlled, brought under a single will, running with the terrible efficiency of a machine in which every part serves the whole, and the whole serves the master. But there was a resistance. The survivors of Menor, Elendil and his sons, the faithful who had opposed Ar-Pharazôn's madness and escaped the drowning, had founded new kingdoms in exile, Arnor in the north and Gondor in the south. And these kingdoms, allied with the elves under Gil-galad, formed the last alliance of elves and men, the final great coalition of the free peoples against the Dark Lord. They marched against Mordor, besieged Barad Dûchtur for 7 years, and at last confronted Sauron himself on the slopes of Mount Doom. The battle was terrible. Gil-galad fell, the High King of the Elves, slain by the hand of Sauron. Elendil fell, the Tall King, the founder of the kingdoms in exile. But in the ruin of that battle, Isildur, Elendil's son, took up his father's broken sword and cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand. And with the ring severed from him, Sauron fell. His body was destroyed, his spirit shattered, his power broken. He was not dead. A Maia cannot truly die in the ordinary sense, but he was so diminished, so reduced, so emptied, that he could not take physical form for centuries. He became a shadow, a formless malice, a whisper and a dread, lingering in the world but unable to act upon it. And the ring? Isildur took it. He claimed it as Wergild for his father's death, a trophy, a prize. He should have destroyed it, should have walked the few steps to the fires of Mount Doom and thrown it in. But the ring worked on him, as it works on everyone. He kept it. And then he lost it in the River Anduin when he was ambushed and killed, the ring slipping from his finger and sinking into the mud of the riverbed, where it would lie hidden for 2,500 years. Sauron had lost the ring. He had lost his body. He had lost his armies, and his fortress, and his fair form. He had lost everything. And any other being, any being of less will, and less patience, and less cold, implacable determination, might have given up. But Sauron was not any other being. He was the being who had served Melkor for thousands of years, who had survived the fall of his master, who had deceived the elves and drowned Menor and forged the One Ring. He was the great survivor, the being who always came back, who always rebuilt, who could be thrown down again and again, and would always, always begin again. And so, in the long dark centuries that followed, the shadow began slowly to stir. Part 14. The Long Rebuilding. The Third Age of Middle-earth was Sauron's long, slow, patient return, and it is, in its way, the most impressive demonstration of his nature. Because he came back from nothing, from a formless shadow, from a whisper on the wind, from a being so diminished it could barely maintain its own existence. From that, across 2,000 years, he rebuilt everything. At first, he was almost nothing, a dread in the air, a shadow on the heart. a formless malice that haunted the lands east of the Anduin. For 1,000 years the memory of him faded. The kingdoms of the Dínadain, the realms founded by the survivors of Menor, grew and prospered and gradually began to decline. Not through any direct assault of Sauron, who was too weak for that, but through the ordinary processes of time and human failure. The kingdoms weakened, the watch slackened, the long peace bred complacency, and in the shadows Sauron gathered himself. Around the year 1000 of the Third Age, a shadow fell on the forest of Greenwood, which would come to be known as Mirkwood. Something dark settled there, in the fortress of Dol Guldur, and the forest sickened around it. Spiders came, and fell things, and a creeping dread. For a long time, nobody knew what dwelt in Dol Guldur. The wise, Gandalf, Saruman, the White Council, suspected, feared, debated. It took centuries more before Gandalf entered the fortress and confirmed the truth. The shadow in Dol Guldur was Sauron, returned, rebuilding his power in secret, biding his time. And this is where the patience, the cold strategic brilliance, the long-game thinking that had always defined Sauron showed itself again. He did not reveal himself too soon. He did not lash out before he was ready. He spent centuries, slowly gathering strength, rebuilding his web of control, reaching out to the east and south to rally his old allies, sending his will into the dark places of the world to wake the things that slumbered there. He searched for the One Ring, knowing that without it he could never reach full power, sending his servants to hunt along the Anduin in the Gladden fields where it had been lost. He rebuilt the Nazgul, sent them out into the world as his agents and his hunters. He prepared, and while he prepared, the Free Peoples did exactly what he expected them to do. They quarreled, they weakened, they forgot. Arna fell, its kingdom shattered, its people scattered into a handful of rangers guarding a land that no longer knew their name. Gondor declined, its population dwindling, its kings failing, its great cities falling into ruin. The elves retreated into their hidden refuges. The dwarves delved too deep and woke horrors in the dark. The world grew weaker, and Sauron grew stronger, and the balance of power shifted slowly, inexorably, in the Dark Lord's favor. This is what makes Sauron so different from Melkor, and in some ways more dangerous. Melkor was a storm, vast, destructive, overwhelming, but ultimately unsustainable. Sauron was a glacier, slow, patient, grinding everything in his path to dust, unstoppable not through force, but through the sheer relentless persistence of his advance. He did not need to win any single battle. He just needed to keep coming, keep building, keep pressing, decade after decade, century after century, until the Free Peoples wore themselves out against his cold, unending patience. Time was on his side. Every year that passed made him stronger and his enemies weaker. All he had to do was wait. Part 15. The Eye That Never Closed. By the time of the War of the Ring, the story we know best, the story of Frodo and the Fellowship, Sauron had become something that no longer quite resembled the being he had once been. The Myron who had loved order and beauty and the perfecting of things was buried so deep beneath the accumulated weight of ages of domination and cruelty and the slow erosion of his own nature that almost nothing of that original spirit remained visible. What remained was the eye. The great lidless eye, wreathed in flame, searching the world from the summit of Barad Dûchtur. Whether this was a literal eye or a metaphor for Sauron's all-searching will is a question Tolkien leaves somewhat open, but the image itself tells us everything about what Sauron had become. He was awareness without rest, vigilance without mercy, a searching will that never stopped looking, never stopped hunting, never closed. The eye that never blinks is the perfect symbol for the will to dominate, always watching, always suspicious, always reaching, never at peace. And notice what is absent from the eye. There is no body, no face, no beautiful form, no fair disguise, nothing recognizably personal or individual. By the end of his long career, Sauron had become almost abstract, a will, an intention, a searching malice, stripped of everything that had once made him a person, and reduced to the essence of his corruption, the naked desire to see and control everything. The journey from Meron to the Eye is the journey from a being with gifts and qualities and a personality to a being that is nothing but the will to dominate, purified of everything else, concentrated into a single burning gaze. This is the final cost of the path Sauron chose. He began as an admirable spirit with a love of order and beauty. He became a lieutenant of darkness, lending his organizational gifts to Melkor's wars. He became a deceiver, wearing fair forms, manipulating the elves. He became a tyrant, ruling through the ring, forging wraiths from kings. He became a destroyer, engineering the downfall of Menor. And at the end of it all, he became nothing but the eye, the will, the hunger for control. Everything else was spent, burned away, poured into his works and his weapons and his wars, until there was nothing left of the original being but the drive that had consumed him. Sauron's fall is complete not when he is defeated, but when you realize what he has become. The being who began with such extraordinary gifts, intelligence, craft, the love of making and of order, ends as a thing without any of those qualities, a thing that can no longer make or create or even think in any way except as a strategist of domination. He cannot enjoy beauty anymore. He cannot take pleasure in craft for its own sake. He cannot love or appreciate or delight in anything. He can only dominate, or try to. The eye is what is left when everything good in a being has been spent in the pursuit of control, when every other quality has been burned as fuel to feed the will to power. The eye is the final answer to the question of what it costs to become the Dark Lord. It costs you everything. Everything except the hunger for more. Part 16. The blind spot. For all his vast intelligence, for all his patience and his cunning and his centuries of careful planning, Sauron had a blind spot. A single fatal gap in his understanding that would, in the end, undo everything he had built. And that blind spot was this: he could not conceive that anyone who possessed the ring would try to destroy it. Think about what this means, because it reveals the final and most important truth about Sauron's nature. He understood power. He understood domination, ambition, the hunger for control. He understood desire and greed and the lust for mastery. He could predict, with uncanny accuracy, the behavior of anyone who wanted power, because he understood wanting power better than any being in the world. Every strategy he built, every defense he erected, every plan he laid, was designed around the assumption that his enemies would try to use the ring against him. He expected them to raise a champion, a new Dark Lord, someone strong enough to wield the ring and challenge him for supremacy. That was the threat he prepared for, the danger he watched for, the enemy he spent his vast intelligence trying to outmaneuver. But the idea that anyone would take the most powerful weapon in the world and walk it into the heart of his own land to destroy it, that simply did not compute. It was outside the range of his thinking, beyond the boundaries of his imagination. Not because Sauron was stupid, he was anything but because his understanding of other minds was limited by the boundaries of his own. He could only imagine that others wanted what he wanted: power, control, domination. He could not imagine a being who would willingly give up power. He could not imagine a hobbit. And this is the final irony of Sauron's story, the irony that brings the whole long arc to its devastating conclusion. The being who had devoted his entire existence to understanding and controlling other wills was undone by a kind of will he could not understand. The small, the humble, the creatures who wanted nothing he could offer, who sought no power and dreamed no dreams of domination, who wanted only to go home and tend their gardens and sit by their fires, these were the beings he could not see, could not predict, could not account for. The master of domination was defeated by the one thing domination cannot comprehend: the willingness to serve rather than to rule, to sacrifice rather than to seize, to carry the great burden not for power, but for love. Sauron's blind spot was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of imagination, a failure born from the very corruption that made him what he was. In becoming the Dark Lord, he had lost the capacity to understand any motivation except the hunger for power. He could not see hobbits because hobbits did not think the way he thought, did not want what he wanted, did not operate on the assumptions that governed his entire worldview. His understanding of the world was total within its range, but its range was defined and limited by his corruption. And outside that range lay the one small, humble, impossible thing that would bring him down. Part 17. The Shapeshifter. One of the most fascinating and least discussed aspects of Sauron's nature is his ability to change his form, a power that he used throughout his career, that reveals something essential about who he was, and that he gradually, tragically, lost. In his earliest days, as Myron, he could take whatever shape he wished. The Maia were spirits, not bound to a single physical form, and Myron could appear as he chose, beautiful or terrible, fair or foul, in any guise that served his purposes. This was not illusion or trickery. It was a genuine capacity of his spiritual nature, the ability of a being who existed primarily in the unseen world to clothe himself in whatever form of flesh he desired when he stepped into the seen world. And Sauron used this gift brilliantly. As Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, he wore a form of surpassing beauty and grace, a shape designed to charm, to persuade, to win trust. When he needed to terrify, he could take a shape of dread, as he did in the First Age when he held the Isle of Werewolves and was a thing of shadow and horror. He could become a serpent, a wolf, a bat. He took many shapes in his contest with the elf lord Finrod and the mortal Beren, shifting from form to form in the duel of songs that he fought with Finrod before casting the Elf King down. He was fluid, adaptable, able to present whatever face the moment required. But with each great defeat, he lost something. After the drowning of Menor, his fair body was destroyed, and he could never again take a beautiful form. The ability to appear as something admirable, something worth trusting, was burned away in the cataclysm he had engineered. He could still take physical shape, a shape of terrible power, a great dark figure, a lord of dread. But the beauty was gone. The gift-giver was gone. The charming stranger who could walk among the elves and win their friendship was gone forever. And after the last alliance, when the ring was cut from his hand, he lost even more. His physical form was destroyed entirely, and it took him centuries to rebuild even a shadow of a body. By the time of the War of the Ring, Tolkien suggests that Sauron had taken shape again, a dark and terrible shape, with a hand missing the finger where the ring had been. But the being who had once been able to assume any form was now trapped in a single dark image, locked into the shape of the monster, unable to be anything else. There is a deep truth hidden in this progressive loss of form. Sauron's shape shifting was an expression of his nature as a spiritual being, a being of the unseen world who could clothe himself freely in whatever physical appearance he chose. But as he poured more and more of his being into domination, into the ring, into the wars and the workings of his power, he lost this freedom. He spent himself, as all great workings of power spend the worker, and the freedom to be anything became the prison of being only one thing: the Dark Lord, the terror, the shadow. The being who had started with infinite possibility, who could have been anything, worn any form, served any purpose, ended locked into a single identity, a single role, a single terrible image that he could never escape. This is the tragedy of Sauron told through his body. The spirit that was once free became imprisoned in its own corruption, the shapeshifter locked into one final shape, the admirable reduced to the abominable. Every form he lost was a mark of how far he had fallen, a visible sign of the spiritual diminishment that came with each deeper commitment to the path of domination. In the end, Sauron had no face, only the eye, the bodiless gaze, the formless will. The being who had once been free to be anything had become unable to be anything at all. Part 18. Sauron and Morgoth. the crucial difference. It would be easy to see Sauron as simply Morgoth's lesser copy, a junior Dark Lord, following in his master's footsteps, running the same playbook on a smaller scale. But this would be a serious misunderstanding of both beings, and the differences between them are crucial to understanding what made Sauron unique and, in some ways, even more dangerous than his master. Morgoth was driven by nihilism, by rage, envy, and a desire to destroy. At his core, Morgoth wanted to ruin what he could not possess, to spoil what he could not create, to drag everything down into the darkness, because the light was a rebuke to his pride. His evil was passionate, personal, rooted in jealousy of Ilúvatar's creative power and hatred of the world that had been made without his consent and that would not submit to his will. Morgoth's ultimate ambition, had he been able to achieve it, would have been the destruction of everything. The unmaking of the world, the return to the void, the triumph of nothing over something. Sauron did not want to destroy the world. He wanted to run it. This distinction matters enormously. Sauron's evil was not nihilistic, but totalitarian. He did not want to break things. He wanted to control them. He did not want chaos. He wanted perfect order, imposed by his will, maintained by his power, serving his design. Where Morgoth was the void, Sauron was the machine, the cold, efficient, organizing intelligence that takes everything free and wild and independent and forces it into the shapes it has decided upon. Morgoth would have burned the garden to ash. Sauron would have paved it over and built a factory on it. This is why Sauron was, in practical terms, often a more effective villain than his master. Morgoth's nihilism was self-defeating. He poured his power into the world and diminished himself, wasted his strength on petty acts of spite, burned through his resources in his rage. Sauron was focused, disciplined, efficient. He did not waste. He built systems. He created hierarchies. He organized his evil into something sustainable, something that could persist and grow and spread across centuries. Morgoth was a bonfire that would eventually burn itself out. Sauron was a slow, cold fire that could burn forever, carefully banked and tended, consuming everything in its path without ever exhausting itself. And there is something more chilling about Sauron's evil because of this difference. Morgoth's evil is dramatic and obviously terrible. Dragons and Balrogs and the breaking of the world. You know you are facing evil when you face Morgoth. But Sauron's evil is insidious, organizational, systematic. It works through bureaucracy and rings and the slow corruption of institutions. It builds systems that look, from the outside, almost reasonable, efficient, well-ordered, productive. And you might not realize until too late that the order is a prison and the efficiency is slavery. Sauron's evil is the evil of the system, the institution, the machine that runs so smoothly that no one notices the people being ground up in its gears. This is why Tolkien considered Sauron a more fitting villain for the story he wanted to tell. Morgoth was the villain of myth, of the great cosmic struggle between creation and destruction. Sauron was the villain of history, of the long struggle between freedom and tyranny, between the messy imperfection of free peoples and the terrible perfection of the ordered state. And it is Sauron's kind of evil, not Morgoth's, that is most relevant to the world we actually live in. The evil of the system, the bureaucracy, the well-organized tyranny that promises order and delivers slavery, the machine that runs on schedule and counts human beings among its fuel. Part 19. What the Ring actually wanted. Let us go deeper into the One Ring, because understanding its behavior, its will, its desires, its long game, tells us something essential about the mind of its maker that even Sauron himself might not have recognized. The ring was, as we have said, a vessel for a portion of Sauron's own will. It carried his power, his malice, his desire for domination. And it acted on those drives even when separated from him, working to return to its master, corrupting those who carried it, betraying bearer after bearer in its long, patient effort to find its way home. But the ring's behavior reveals something about Sauron that goes beyond strategy. It reveals the shape of his soul. The ring corrupts by offering you what you most desire, and then twisting that desire into a tool of domination. For Boromir, it offered the salvation of his people. For Galadriel, it offered the power to preserve and protect at the highest level. For Gandalf, it offered the power to do unlimited good, to order the world wisely and well. The ring knew, with uncanny precision, the deepest want of every heart it touched, and it used that want as the lever to pry the soul open. This is Sauron, expressed through his creation. The ring's ability to find and exploit desire is Sauron's own ability, the talent of the deceiver, the insight of the manipulator, the capacity to look into a person's heart and find the handle there. The being who deceived the elves of Eregion, who seduced the Enmemrians to their doom, who played on the fears and the ambitions of mortal kings through the 9 rings. That being is present in every temptation the ring offers. The ring is Sauron's personality made portable, his method of corruption distilled into a single object. But there is something else, something that suggests an unintended truth embedded in the ring's nature. The ring can find what everyone desires, but it can only offer one solution to every desire: domination. It cannot offer healing, though it tempts healers. It cannot offer preservation, though it tempts preservers. It cannot offer justice, though it tempts the just. Every road it opens leads to the same destination: the throne of the Dark Lord, the seat of total control. And this is because Sauron himself can only conceive of one response to any problem: impose your will. The ring's limitations are Sauron's limitations. It cannot imagine any solution that does not involve domination, because Sauron cannot imagine any such solution. The ring is a mirror of its maker's mind, and what it reveals is a mind of extraordinary power and extraordinary narrowness, a mind that can see everything except the one thing that matters most, that domination is not the answer to every question. Part 20. The servants he made. Sauron's genius for organization extended beyond armies and rings to the creation of an entire system of servitude, a hierarchy of evil carefully structured, in which every servant had a role and every role served the master's will. Understanding this system tells us something important about the kind of Dark Lord he was and the kind of world he wanted to build. At the top were the Nazgul, the 9 ringwraiths, his most intimate and most utterly dominated servants, beings who had been completely consumed by the power of the rings, who existed only as extensions of Sauron's will, whose very souls were locked in the One Ring. Below them were the Lesser Lords, the mouth of Sauron, that unnamed man who had served the Dark Lord so long he had forgotten his own name, who served as Sauron's lieutenant and ambassador, the Black Enmemrians. Descendants of those who had followed Sauron in the old days, who had given themselves to his service across generations, the sorcerers and the petty tyrants who ruled in his name in the dark places of the world. Below them were the armies, the orcs, the trolls, the Easterlings and the Southrons, the vast and varied forces that Sauron gathered under his banner. And here is where his organizational genius truly showed. Because Sauron did not simply raise a horde. He built a military machine. His orcs were organized into units, supplied, equipped, disciplined. Not the mindless mob that Morgoth had used, but something closer to an actual army, capable of sustained campaigns and coordinated action. His alliances with the men of the East and South were cultivated over centuries, maintained through a careful mix of fear, reward, and the exploitation of old grievances against the West. He did not simply conquer his allies, he managed them, kept them useful, played them against each other when necessary. And below everything, holding up the whole vast structure, was the will of Sauron himself, reaching through the ring, through the Nazgul, through the chains of command that ran from the Dark Tower to the furthest corners of his domain. One will, one purpose, one design, imposed on everything and everyone, with no room for dissent, no tolerance for independence, no space for any thought or desire that was not aligned with the Master's purpose. This is the world Sauron wanted to build. Not a world of chaos, like Morgoth's, a world of order, of hierarchy, of every being knowing its place and fulfilling its function in service to the one will at the top. It is the vision of the totalitarian state brought to its ultimate expression, a world in which every creature, from the greatest ringwraith to the smallest orc, exists only to serve, only to obey, only to feed the machine of domination. And the terrible thing about it is that it works. Sauron's system was efficient. His armies were effective. His intelligence network was vast. His reach was long. The machine ran smoothly, and it produced results, and from the outside it might even have looked impressive, if you could ignore the fact that every part of the machine was a soul in chains. Part 21. The Psychology of Falling. I want to step back now and look at Sauron's whole arc, from Mairon to the Eye, and ask what it tells us about how corruption actually works, because I think there is a psychology running through his story that is more sophisticated and more disturbing than most readers recognize. Sauron's fall was not a single catastrophic event. It was a process, a slow accumulation of choices, each one carrying him a small step further from what he had been. And the terrible thing is that at every step his choices were internally consistent. He did not suddenly become someone else. He became more and more fully himself. Or rather, more and more fully the worst version of himself. The version in which his love of order had been purified of every moderating quality and concentrated into a single white-hot will to control. Look at the progression. First, he loved order and was frustrated by the slow, messy freedom of the Valar's way. That is a recognizable, almost sympathetic frustration. Who hasn't wished that the world were better organized? Then he was drawn to Melkor's vision of imposed order, seduced by the promise of efficiency and results. Still comprehensible, still humanly understandable, the step from wanting things to be better to being willing to force them to be better is not a huge one. Then he served Melkor, lending his gifts to evil purposes, learning the tools of domination while telling himself, perhaps, that the ends justified the means. Then Melkor fell, and Sauron was offered redemption and refused it, choosing pride over humility, autonomy over submission to judgment. Then he struck out on his own, deceiving the elves, forging the ring, building his own dominion. Then he destroyed Menor. Then he built Mordor. Each step led to the next. Each choice made the next choice easy. Each commitment to domination made the next commitment seem more natural, more necessary, more inevitable. This is how corruption works. Not in a single dramatic fall, but in a long series of small steps, each one seeming reasonable at the time, each one carrying you just a little further from where you started. You do not wake up one morning and decide to be evil. You wake up one morning and realize that you have become something you would not recognize, and that the road to this moment was made of choices you can still defend individually, even though the destination they have brought you to is indefensible. Sauron could probably justify every single decision he made. Each one, taken in isolation, had a logic to it. It is only when you step back and see the whole arc, from Mairon the Admirable to the Dark Lord of Mordor, that the horror of it becomes clear. The horror of a perfectly reasonable series of steps leading to an utterly unreasonable destination. And here is the part that should unsettle us most. The qualities that drove Sauron's fall are not alien qualities. The love of order, the desire for things to work properly, the impatience with waste and inefficiency, the conviction that you know how things should be done and that others are doing it wrong, these are recognizable, common, everyday human tendencies. Sauron's path to the Dark Lord began with perfectly ordinary feelings that anyone might have. The difference between Mairon and us is not that he started with different values, but that he took those values further than they should go, past the point where love of order becomes the will to impose order, past the point where desire for perfection becomes intolerance of freedom, past the point where confidence in your own judgment becomes the refusal to submit to anyone else's. The distance from Meron to Sauron is not a gulf. It is a slope, and we all stand on it. Part 21.5. Saruman's Mirror. And if you want proof that the slope is real, that the same fall can happen to different beings walking the same path, look at Saruman. Because Saruman's corruption is, in miniature, a recapitulation of Sauron's own fall, and the parallels are so precise that they seem almost intentional. Saruman was the head of the Order of Wizards, the most learned and the most skilled among them, respected and trusted by the wise. He was sent to Middle-earth to help the free peoples resist the shadow, to counsel, to advise, to serve. His gifts were enormous, a commanding voice, a brilliant analytical mind, an understanding of the mechanisms of power that surpassed even Gandalf's. He was, in many ways, the most capable being the Valar sent to Middle-earth in the Third Age. And he fell, step by step, through a process so similar to Sauron's that it reads like a parable of the same corruption, expressed in a different key. First, Saruman studied Sauron, studied the ring law, studied the methods of domination, studied the techniques of power. He told himself he was studying the enemy in order to defeat the enemy. But the study changed him. The more he learned about domination, the more he began to understand its logic, and the more he understood its logic, the more it began to seem reasonable, efficient, practical. Why fight the methods of the enemy when you could use them yourself, but for better ends? Why struggle against domination when domination was so effective? Saruman began to think like the thing he was studying, and thinking like it was the first step toward becoming it. Then came the impatience. Saruman grew frustrated with the slow, patient methods of the wise, the endless counsels, the cautious deliberations, the refusal to act decisively. The free peoples were disorganized, foolish, wasting time and strength in their petty quarrels. Someone needed to take charge. Someone needed to impose order, to cut through the confusion, to act with the efficiency and the decisiveness that the situation demanded. And who was better qualified than Saruman, the most learned and most capable of the wizards? Do you hear the echo? The same frustration with freedom's inefficiency. The same conviction that he knew best. The same impatience with cooperation. The same hunger for command. The same slide from wanting to help to wanting to control. Saruman walked the same road Myron had walked thousands of years before, driven by the same impulses, seduced by the same logic, falling through the same stages, from service to study to impatience to ambition to domination. And in the end, Saruman became a small-scale version of the thing he had set out to defeat. A petty tyrant, a builder of orc armies, a cutter of forests, a dominator of wills, ruling his little domain of Isengard with the same cold efficiency that Sauron ruled Mordor. He even built his own tower, or Thank, a lesser Barad-dûrta. He enslaved the nearby peoples, a lesser version of the Nazgul's subjugation. He bred his own army of Uruk-hai, a lesser version of Mordor's legions. He was, in every detail, a copy of Sauron, and he had become that copy through the same process, walking the same path, making the same choices, at every step telling himself the same lies. Sauron had done to Saruman exactly what Morgoth had done to Meron. Not deliberately, perhaps, not through a direct seduction, not in person, but through the sheer gravitational pull of his example, the seductive logic of his methods, the way that studying domination leads, almost inevitably, to practicing it. Saruman was not corrupted by a ring or by a whisper in the dark. He was corrupted by the idea, by the concept of domination as efficiency, by the model of a world ordered by a single will, by the vision that Sauron embodied and that Saruman, in studying it too closely, in understanding it too well, absorbed into himself. The corruption spread not through force, but through comprehension, like a disease you catch by examining the patient too closely. That is the final and most disturbing proof that Sauron's fall was not unique, not unrepeatable, not limited to a single doomed spirit in the deep past. The same fall can happen to anyone. It happened to Meron. It happened to Saruman. It can happen wherever a brilliant mind convinces itself that its own vision of order is worth more than the freedom of others. Wherever the study of power becomes the love of power. Wherever the desire to serve curdles into the desire to command. The slope is real. And Saruman's mirror shows us that even the wise, even those sent specifically to resist the corruption, can slip. Part 22. Why he could not understand Frodo. Of all the encounters that never happened in the War of the Ring, perhaps the most revealing is the one between Sauron and Frodo, a confrontation that never took place in person but that existed, in a sense, throughout the entire quest, as two fundamentally incompatible visions of the world moved toward their final collision. Sauron could not understand Frodo. He could not grasp the idea of a small, weak, unremarkable creature who had been given the most powerful object in the world and who was walking toward the one place where it could be destroyed, not to use it, not to seize power with it, not to raise himself to glory, but to throw it away. This was, in Sauron's terms, insanity. It violated every assumption he had about how minds work, about what beings want, about the fundamental drives that govern behavior. Sauron believed, had to believe, because his whole worldview depended on it, that all beings ultimately wanted power, that all beings would seize it if they could, that the desire for domination was the universal constant of all hearts. Frodo disproved that belief with every step he took toward Mount Doom, and Sauron could not see him. This is not just a strategic failure, it is a philosophical one. The eye that searched the world, the will that reached into every shadow and every corner, it never found Frodo. Never noticed the hobbit creeping toward the fire, never turned its gaze to the one tiny figure upon whom the fate of everything depended. And this was not because Sauron was careless. He was anything but. He watched the west with ferocious intensity, looking for the signs of a new power rising, a champion wielding his ring, a lord of war challenging his dominion. He watched for the big threat, the obvious threat, the threat that made sense in terms of his own worldview. He never watched for the small threat, the humble threat, the threat that did not seek power, but sought to destroy it. There is a scene near the end of the story that captures this with devastating clarity. At the Battle of the Black Gate, Aragorn leads the remnant of the armies of the West in what appears to be a suicidal assault on Mordor, a last desperate charge against overwhelming odds, seemingly mad, seemingly futile. And Sauron, watching from his tower, believes he understands. This, he thinks, is the new ring-bearer, the champion of the West, drunk on the ring's power, come to challenge the Dark Lord for supremacy. Sauron's attention, his armies, his whole vast strategic focus, all of it turns toward the Black Gate, toward the threat he can understand, the challenge that fits his model of how the world works. And while his eye is fixed on the great battle, two tiny hobbits creep up the slopes of Mount Doom with the ring in their keeping, utterly invisible to the gaze of the most watchful being in the world. The irony is absolute. Sauron's intelligence, his strategic brilliance, his vast capacity for analysis and prediction, all of it was useless against an enemy he could not conceive of. The master planner, undone by a variable he could not have predicted, because it fell outside the categories of his understanding. The being who knew more about domination than any creature alive was defeated by the one thing domination cannot account for, the small, stubborn, humble refusal to dominate. Part 23. The fall of Barad Doctor, and then the ring went into the fire. Not through Frodo's strength. In the end, even the greatest hobbit, even the most humble and the most resistant of all the ring's bearers, could not willingly destroy it at the last. At the crack of doom, standing at the very edge of the fire, Frodo claimed the ring for his own. The burden he had carried across all of Middle-earth had finally taken him, and the ring won, as it always won, because no one, not even Frodo, could willingly choose to destroy a part of Sauron's will while standing in the heart of Sauron's power. But Gollum was there. Gollum, the wretched, the pitiable, the creature who had been spared by Bilbo's mercy and then by Frodo's mercy, the miserable thing that no strategist would have counted and no Dark Lord would have noticed, Gollum lunged for the ring, bit it from Frodo's hand, danced in triumph on the brink of the abyss, and fell. And the ring fell with him, into the fire, into the crack from which it had been forged, and was unmade. And Sauron fell. The destruction was instant and total. The moment the ring entered the fire, Sauron's power collapsed. Barad-dûr crumbled, its foundations shattered, its great tower falling in ruin, the physical structure of his dominion collapsing, because the spiritual power that sustained it was gone. The Nazgul, sustained by the ring, were destroyed, their enslaved spirits released at last, their long unliving ended, their hollow existence snuffed out with the thing that had held them in thrall. The armies of Mordor, held together by Sauron's will, broke and scattered. The shadow that had lain over the world for thousands of years lifted, and the sun came through. And Sauron, the being who had been Mairon the Admirable, who had served Melkor through the long wars of the First Age, who had deceived the elves and drowned Menor and forged the rings of power, and built and rebuilt and built again across 3 ages of the world, Sauron was reduced to nothing. Not destroyed, exactly. A Maia cannot be destroyed in the absolute sense. But so diminished, so emptied, so stripped of power and will and the capacity to affect the world, that he was effectively ended. A formless malice, a whisper without a voice, a shadow without strength, unable ever again to take shape or to influence the world he had spent his entire existence trying to control. The Dark Lord was done. Not killed, but something worse, rendered irrelevant. Reduced from the greatest power in Middle-earth to a thing of no account, a spirit so diminished it could never again do anything, could never again build or plan or dominate, or even, perhaps, think in any coherent way. The great will was broken. The great intelligence was scattered. The being who had bent all his enormous gifts toward the single purpose of controlling everything was left with the ability to control nothing, not even himself. Part 24. What was left of Mairon? After the ring was destroyed and Sauron's power was broken, what remained? What was left of the spirit that had once been Mairon the Admirable, after all the ages of corruption and domination and the final catastrophic loss of the ring? Tolkien suggests that what remained was a spirit of malice, a formless, powerless, lingering thing, unable to take shape or to act, enduring in a kind of existence that was barely existence at all. Not dead, but worse than dead, conscious, perhaps, but impotent, aware of the world it had lost the ability to touch, carrying still the memories of what it had been and what it had done, but unable ever to do anything again. An eternal irrelevance, a ghost of a ghost, a malice without a voice. Think about what that means for the being who had once been Mairon. Once he had been admired. His name meant the Admirable. He had been gifted, brilliant, one of the most talented spirits in all of creation, possessed of extraordinary intelligence and craft and the capacity for great works. He had been, in the beginning, a being of real worth, a spirit whose gifts could have enriched the world immeasurably, whose love of order and beauty, properly directed, could have been a force for genuine good. He could have been one of the great benefactors of creation, a spirit whose works adorned the world and made it better. That was his potential. That was what he started with. And he ended as a whisper. A nothing, a malice without form, power, or purpose, lingering on the edges of the world, unable to affect anything, unable to build anything, unable even to take the shape of the being he had once been. Everything he had built, the kingdoms, the towers, the rings, the armies, the vast apparatus of domination that had taken him thousands of years to construct, all of it was gone, unmade, dissolved with the destruction of the ring. The long, patient work of ages, the centuries of planning, the wars and the deceptions and the intricate webs of control, all of it reduced to rubble and ash, and a formless whisper in the void. There is a question that lingers over Sauron's ending, a question that Tolkien does not answer directly, but that the whole arc of the story invites us to ask, did Sauron at the very end understand what he had done to himself? Did the spirit that had once been Mairon, stripped of everything, reduced to nothing, look back over the vast sweep of its existence and understand, truly understand, the enormity of what it had lost? Not the power, not the dominion, not the armies and the towers. The thing it had been before all of that, the being it could have been if it had chosen differently, the potential that was squandered, the gifts that were perverted, the admirable spirit that had become the abominable one through a long series of choices that each seemed reasonable at the time. We do not know. Tolkien leaves it unresolved, and perhaps it must be. Perhaps the final tragedy of Sauron is that he ended too diminished even to understand what he had lost. That the corruption was so total that no part of Mairon remained capable of seeing the whole arc, of grasping the full scope of the fall, of feeling the grief that the distance between the beginning and the end should rightly inspire. Perhaps the cruelest punishment for what Sauron became is simply to be it, to exist as a formless malice, without even the clarity of mind to understand that it was once something better, that there was once a being named Mairon who loved order and beauty and who could have been, if he had chosen differently, something magnificent. Part 25. The Rings and what they reveal. Let us return to the Rings of Power one more time, because there is a dimension of them we have not yet explored. What the different fates of the different rings tell us about the different peoples of Middle-earth, and about Sauron's understanding and misunderstanding of those peoples. Sauron made the rings to dominate. That was their single purpose. But the way they worked on their bearers varied enormously depending on who bore them, and the variations reveal something about both the bearers and the mind that tried to ensnare them. The 9 rings, given to mortal men, worked exactly as Sauron intended. Men were susceptible to the ring's promises. Long life, power, glory, because men fear death and crave significance. And the rings spoke directly to those fears and cravings. The 9 kings who received them were great men, proud men, men of ambition and will. The rings amplified those qualities, fed them, inflated them, until the men were so stretched by the unnatural extension of their lives and the unnatural expansion of their power that they faded into wraiths, hollow shells, all substance burned away, existing only as instruments of the will that had captured them. The 9 rings were Sauron's greatest success, his proof of concept, the demonstration that his method of domination through gifts could work perfectly on the right targets. The 7 rings, given to dwarf lords, were a different story. The dwarves proved far more resistant to domination than Sauron had expected. Their stubbornness, their fierce independence, the particular quality of their creation by all, something in the dwarves made them impossible to enslave as the men had been enslaved. The 7 rings could not make wraiths of them. Instead, the rings amplified what was already strong in the dwarves, their love of craft, their hunger for gold, their fierce possessiveness. The rings made the dwarf lords richer, more powerful, more obsessed with their hoards, but they did not break them, did not hollow them out, did not reduce them to servants of Sauron's will. The dwarves wore the rings and remained stubbornly, immovably themselves, impossible to dominate, impossible to control. Sauron must have been furious. The dwarves broke his model. They demonstrated that domination through gifts did not work on everyone, that there were beings in the world whose nature resisted his method. And this is important, because it reveals a limit to Sauron's understanding, a blind spot, not about hobbits who he never considered at all, but about the dwarves, whose nature he underestimated because he did not make them and did not fully understand them. The dwarves were Ol's children, not Ilvatar's, and something in their making, some quality of stubbornness, some resistance woven into their very being by the hand of the smith, put them beyond the reach of Sauron's rings. And the 3 rings? The elven rings? The elves never wore them while Sauron held the one. They felt his presence the moment he put it on and removed theirs immediately. The 3 were kept hidden, used only after the one was lost, and used for preservation rather than domination. To heal, to protect, to hold back the fading of the world. The three rings were, in a sense, the elves' answer to Sauron's vision, the same craft, the same type of object, but directed toward the opposite purpose. Where Sauron used rings to dominate, the elves used rings to preserve. Where the one ring was a chain, the three were shields. Same tool, opposite use. And in that contrast lies the whole moral heart of the story of the Rings of Power. Part 26. What Sauron taught his enemies. There is a strange and bitter irony running through the whole history of Sauron's dealings with the free peoples. In trying to dominate them, he taught them how to resist him. In many ways, the very thoroughness of his evil created the conditions for his defeat. The fall of Menor taught the survivors to be wary. Elendil and the faithful, who escaped the drowning, built their kingdoms in exile with a vigilance born of having seen what Sauron could do from the inside. They established watches, built fortresses along borders of Mordor, maintained the Palantry, the Seeing Stones, to stay alert against the darkness. They had witnessed the destruction of the greatest civilization of men, and they were determined never to be so deceived again. Sauron's greatest triumph, the corruption and destruction of Menor, created the very people who would form the last alliance against him. The war with the elves taught them to guard the three rings. Because Sauron had revealed his hand too soon, because the elves had felt his dominating will through the rings and had immediately understood the danger, they knew to hide the three, to keep them secret, to use them only when the one was lost. Sauron's attempt to ensnare the elves failed so spectacularly that it inoculated them against future attempts. They knew what rings could do because he had shown them. And the long centuries of Sauron's shadow over the Third Age, the slow grinding pressure of his rebuilding power, created the conditions for the very resistance that would eventually bring him down. The Rangers of the North, the last descendants of the lost kingdom of Arna, kept their watch through the long ages specifically because the threat of Sauron would not go away. Gandalf was sent to Middle-earth specifically to counter the growing shadow. The White Council was formed specifically to watch for Sauron's return. Every instrument of resistance that would eventually contribute to his defeat was called into being by the threat he posed. He was, in a sense, the author of his own opposition. This is one of the great themes of Tolkien's world, that evil contains within itself the seeds of its own defeat, that the very act of domination creates the resistance that will eventually overthrow it. Sauron's evil was so thorough, so persistent, so all-encompassing that it generated, as a kind of immune response, exactly the coalition and the strategy that would destroy him. He could not dominate without creating enemies. He could not impose his will without awakening the will to resist. The machine of domination, by its very operation, produced the thing that would eventually break it. Part 27. The War He Almost Won. Before we go further, it is worth pausing to acknowledge something that sometimes gets lost in the telling. Sauron almost won. The War of the Ring was not a glorious triumph of good over evil. It was a desperate, last-ditch, nearly hopeless gamble that came within a razor's edge of total failure. And understanding how close Sauron came to victory deepens our appreciation of both his danger and the extraordinary improbability of his defeat. Consider the state of the world at the beginning of the War of the Ring, from Sauron's perspective. His position was, by every rational measure, overwhelmingly strong. He held Mordor, a fortress land nearly impossible to invade. He commanded vast armies, orcs, trolls, Easterlings, Southrons, legions upon legions, more than the free peoples could hope to match. He had the Nazgul, the most terrifying single weapon on the battlefield. He had Saruman, the head of the Wizard's Order, either as an ally, a rival, or an unwitting servant. It hardly mattered which, since Saruman's war on Rohan served Sauron's purposes regardless. He had the Corsairs of Umbar threatening Gondor from the south. He had allies in the east who would pin down the forces of Dale and Erebor. He had the slow decay of centuries weakening his enemies from within. Against all of this, the Free Peoples had what? A dying kingdom with no king. A wizard. A handful of rangers. A few elven refuges, beautiful but fading. And a hobbit with a ring. On paper, this was no contest. Sauron should have won. His forces were stronger, his position more secure, his intelligence better, his patience greater. The Free Peoples were divided, weakened, outnumbered, and fighting a war they could not win by force of arms. The only path to victory, the destruction of the ring, was so improbable, so mad, so contrary to every reasonable expectation, that Sauron never considered it a genuine threat, and he was not wrong to dismiss it. The plan was insane. It depended on luck, on providence, on a chain of events so unlikely that no sane strategist would have bet on it. And yet, it worked. Not because Sauron was stupid, but because the world was kinder and stranger than he could imagine. Because a hobbit showed mercy to a creature in the dark, decades before, and that mercy produced the unwitting instrument of the ring's destruction at the very moment when all other hope was lost. Because the providence that Sauron could not see and could not account for was woven into the fabric of the world, guiding events through channels invisible to even the most watchful of eyes. Sauron was defeated not by a flaw in his strategy, but by a dimension of reality he did not believe existed. The mercy and the grace and the hidden design that operated outside his categories and beyond his understanding. Part 28. The Tragedy of Potential. I want to sit with something uncomfortable for a moment, because I think it is the single most important thing about Sauron's story, and it is the thing that makes his fall a tragedy rather than merely a cautionary tale. And it is this: Sauron could have been magnificent, not magnificent in the way he was, not the dark magnificence of the tyrant and the conqueror, magnificent in the other way, in the way that Myron was supposed to be magnificent, before the corruption, before the fall. If Sauron had never turned to Melkor's service, if Myron the Admirable had remained among the servants of all and used his extraordinary gifts as they were meant to be used, in service, in making, in the patient work of enriching the world, what might he have accomplished? Picture it. A Maia of unmatched craft and intelligence, devoted to the ordering and perfecting of the world, not through domination, but through the patient, cooperative, loving work of making things better. A spirit who could organize anything, plan across centuries, see the subtle connections between distant events, and who used all of that brilliance not to control but to serve. A great builder, not of prisons but of wonders. A great maker, not of chains but of gifts. A counselor to the Free Peoples, a master craftsman whose works rivaled the greatest of the elves. A force for order who achieved his beloved order not by imposing it, but by helping things grow into their own best shapes. That was the potential. That was what was lost when Myron became Sauron, not just a servant of evil, but a force for good that the world will never have. The gifts that could have enriched the world were turned instead to its impoverishment. The intelligence that could have served was bent to domination. The love of order that could have created beauty was twisted into the construction of prisons. And the world is poorer for it. Poorer not just because Sauron did terrible things, but because the magnificent good things he could have done, had he remained true to his original nature, were never done at all. This is the hidden dimension of every fall, the loss that is not often counted, the good that was never realized, the potential that was never fulfilled, the beauty that was never made because the one who could have made it chose a darker path. When we count the cost of Sauron's fall, we usually count the evils he committed. The wars, the slavery, the death, the ruin of Menor. But there is another cost, a shadow cost, an invisible ledger of all the good he could have done and didn't, all the wonders he could have made and didn't, all the beauty he could have added to the world and didn't, because he spent his gifts on domination instead. That invisible ledger is, I think, the truest measure of the tragedy. The Dark Lord was a waste, a monstrous, heartbreaking waste of gifts that should have been a blessing and became a curse. Part 29. The Mirror of Gandalf. There is a reason Tolkien made Gandalf, the hero who opposes Sauron throughout the story, a being of the same order. Gandalf is a Maia, just as Sauron is a Maia. They were peers once, in the timeless existence before the world. They were spirits of the same kind, possessed of similar capacities, and they both entered the world to shape it. The difference between them is not a difference of kind, but of choice. And that parallel, that mirroring, is one of the most important structural features of the whole story. Gandalf represents what Sauron could have been. A Maia who uses his power in service rather than domination. A wise spirit who works through counsel rather than command. Who kindles courage in others rather than bending their wills. Who accepts limitations on his own power rather than grasping for more. Gandalf is the road not taken, the version of Myron who chose the patient way, the cooperative way, the humble way, who accepted the limits placed on him by the Valar and worked within those limits to accomplish what he could. And Gandalf knew the danger that Sauron represented, because he recognized the temptation in himself. When Frodo offers Gandalf the ring, the wizard recoils in genuine terror, not because he fears the ring's evil, but because he fears his own capacity for the kind of domination the ring enables. Gandalf knows that he too has the gift of organization, the hunger for order, the capacity to see how things should be, and the power to make them so. If he took the ring, he would use it to do good, or so he would tell himself at first. He would order the world wisely and well. He would bring peace. He would solve the problems that frustrate him. And he would become, with the best intentions in the world, another Sauron. This is the razor's edge that Gandalf walks throughout the whole story, and it is the reason he is the perfect opponent for the Dark Lord. He understands Sauron's temptation from the inside. He can feel the pull of the same desires that corrupted Myron, the desire for a world that works properly, the impatience with the messy freedom of others, the conviction that he knows best. And he resists those desires, day after day, year after year, through a long and exhausting discipline of humility and restraint. Gandalf's heroism is not the heroism of the warrior, but the heroism of the one who could dominate and chooses not to, who holds back his power, who works through others, who lets the free peoples make their own choices, even when those choices seem foolish or wrong. Gandalf and Sauron are the same kind of being, facing the same fundamental choice, the choice between service and domination, between working with the freedom of the world and imposing your will upon it. One chose domination and became the Dark Lord. The other chose service and became the Grey Pilgrim. And the whole story turns on that difference. The distance between two spirits of the same order, the same kind, the same capacity, who made opposite choices and became opposite things. Part 30. Why Sauron cannot understand sacrifice. We have said that Sauron's great blind spot was his inability to conceive of anyone wanting to destroy the ring. But let us go even deeper into that blindness, because it extends beyond strategy into the fundamental structure of his understanding. Sauron cannot understand sacrifice. He cannot understand the willingness to give up something precious for the sake of others. He cannot understand Frodo carrying the ring to its destruction, or Sam refusing to abandon his master, or Aragorn leading a suicidal charge against the Black Gate to buy the ring-bearer time. He cannot understand any of it, because sacrifice is, by its nature, the opposite of everything Sauron believes in. Sacrifice is the voluntary surrender of power, the choice to give up something you have, something you could use, something that could benefit you, for the sake of someone or something beyond yourself. It is the opposite of domination. Where domination gathers power inward, sacrifice pours power outward. Where domination controls, sacrifice releases. Where domination insists on the self, sacrifice transcends the self. Everything that sacrifice is, domination is not, and vice versa. And this is why it is invisible to Sauron. His entire worldview is built on the assumption that all beings operate by the logic of domination, that all beings want power, seek control, pursue their own advantage at the expense of others. In his universe, sacrifice makes no sense. It is irrational, counterproductive, a failure of will. Why would anyone give up power when they could keep it? Why would anyone serve when they could rule? Why would anyone walk into the fire when they could seize the ring and become a lord? These questions have no answers within Sauron's framework, because the framework itself excludes the possibility of the kind of love that makes sacrifice meaningful. And this exclusion is not just a strategic weakness. It is the final proof of Sauron's corruption, the evidence that the being who once loved beauty and order has become so twisted that he has lost the ability to understand the most fundamental force in the world, love that gives rather than takes. Myron, perhaps, could have understood sacrifice once. Myron, who loved making and crafting and the creation of beauty, might have understood the impulse to pour yourself out into your work, to give your best for something beyond yourself. But Sauron has travelled so far from Myron that even the memory of that understanding is gone. He can only see the world through the lens of domination, and through that lens, sacrifice is invisible, incomprehensible, as impossible as a colour he cannot perceive. This is the ultimate cost of becoming the Dark Lord. Not just the loss of power at the end, when the ring goes into the fire. Not just the loss of form, of beauty, of the ability to create. The ultimate cost is the loss of understanding, the loss of the ability to comprehend the thing that makes the world beautiful and worth saving. Sauron cannot understand love. He cannot understand mercy. He cannot understand sacrifice. And in that triple blindness, in that inability to see the very forces that animate the hearts of his enemies and that ultimately bring him down, we see the fullest measure of what his fall has cost him. He has not just become evil, he has become unable to understand good. And that, perhaps, is the darkest prison of all. The prison of a mind that has locked out everything except the logic of domination, and that can never again see the world as anything other than a field of wills to be mastered. Part 31. The Lee Sauron told himself. Every great villain has a story they tell themselves about who they are, a narrative that justifies their actions and makes their evil feel, from the inside, like something other than evil. Sauron was no exception, and the lie he told himself is worth examining, because it is the lie that sustained him across all the long ages of his career, and because it is a lie that is still told, in our own world, by those who would dominate others for their own good. The lie is this, that order justifies any means of achieving it, that the vision of the world set right, efficient, organized, running smoothly, every part in its proper place, is so important, so necessary, so obviously desirable, that any method of getting there is acceptable. That the freedom of others is a luxury that can be sacrificed in the service of the greater good. That the ends justify the means, always, because the ends are so self-evidently correct that no price is too high to pay for them. This is the lie that took Mairon from Ul's forges to the throne of Mordor. At every step, he told himself that what he was doing was necessary, that the world needed to be ordered, that the chaos and the waste and the stupid self-defeating freedom of the peoples of Middle-earth could not be allowed to continue, that someone, and who better than him, needed to take charge and set things right. The methods might be harsh, but the vision was noble. The means might be cruel, but the end was good. The chains might be heavy, but the order they produced was worth the weight. And the terrible thing is that this lie never runs out of fuel, because the world is always imperfect. There is always more chaos, more waste, more inefficiency, more of the messy human or elvish or dwarvish freedom that produces such untidy results. The lie feeds itself. Every failure of freedom justifies more control. Every imperfection justifies more force. Every stumble justifies tighter chains. And so the lie grows, and the control grows with it, and the being at the center of it all tells themselves with perfect sincerity that they are making things better, even as they make everything worse. Sauron believed his own lie. He had to, because the alternative was to face what he had actually become. A tyrant, a slaver, a corrupter of everything he touched. a being who had turned every gift he possessed into a weapon against the world he claimed to be fixing. The lie was the wall between Sauron and the truth about himself, and he maintained it with the same iron will with which he maintained everything else. He could not let it fall, because behind it was the full horror of what he had done and what he had become, and that horror was too vast for any being, even Sauron, to face. This is why his moment of possible redemption at the end of the First Age failed. When the Herald of the Valar offered him a chance to repent and submit to judgment, what that really meant was, let the lie fall. Stop telling yourself the story that justifies everything. Face the truth about what you have done and what you have become. And Sauron could not do it, not because he was too evil to repent, but because the lie had become so much a part of him that dismantling it would have felt like the destruction of the self. His identity was built on the lie. To let it go would have been to face a reckoning so vast and so devastating that it felt to him like annihilation. And so he chose the lie, chose to keep being Sauron, chose the dark path over the terrible brightness of the truth, because the lie, for all its horror, was at least familiar, at least his own, at least a story in which he was the hero rather than the villain. Part 32. The Warning That Echoes. Sauron's story is set in an invented world, among invented peoples, in a history that never happened. And yet it echoes through our own world, through our own history, through the endless repetition of the same patterns of corruption and domination, and the same lies told in the service of the same dark purposes. Because the thing about Sauron's kind of evil is that it is not fantastical. It is in many ways the most realistic kind of evil in all of fantasy literature. The desire to impose order, the impatience with freedom, the conviction that you know best, that the world needs your hand on the wheel, that the messy, stumbling, imperfect choices of free people are a problem to be solved rather than a right to be protected. The slow slide from wanting things to be better to being willing to force them, from loving order to hating freedom, from seeking perfection to demanding obedience. This is not a fantasy. This is history. This is the story of every tyrant who ever rose to power with a vision of how things should be and a willingness to crush anyone who stood in the way of that vision. Tolkien knew this. He was a man who lived through 2 world wars, who watched totalitarian ideologies rise and consume nations, who saw firsthand what happens when the will to dominate disguises itself as the desire to improve. He wrote Sauron not as a fantasy monster, but as a portrait of a particular kind of evil, the evil that comes with plans and charts and a vision of the future, the evil that builds its prisons out of blueprints and efficiency reports, the evil that can always explain why the cruelty is necessary and the freedom is expendable. Sauron is the totalitarian, the bureaucrat of darkness, the manager of hell. And Tolkien feared that kind of evil more than any other, because he understood that it was the kind most likely to succeed, the kind most likely to present itself as reasonable, the kind most likely to be welcomed through the front door by people who were simply tired of chaos and wanted someone to make the trains run on time. This is the warning that echoes out of Sauron's story and into our own lives. Beware the one who promises to fix everything. Beware the one who says the world needs a strong hand, that freedom is a luxury we cannot afford, that the chaos will be tamed if only we surrender a little more control. Beware the vision of perfection that has no room in it for the imperfect, no tolerance for the messy, no space for the free choice that might choose wrongly. Beware, above all, the one who tells you that domination is service, that control is care, that the prison is for your protection. That is the lie Sauron told. That is the lie that tyrants have always told. And the answer to it always is the same. Freedom is messy and imperfect and wasteful and sometimes foolish, and it is worth more than all the dark perfection in the world. Part 33. The Shadow over Greenwood. Let us go back to a particular chapter of Sauron's long rebuilding, because it reveals something about his method that the grand sweep of history can obscure, the way he worked on the small scale, the intimate scale, the level of individual places and peoples, spreading his influence like a slow poison through the veins of the world. When Sauron first returned as a shadow in the Third Age, he did not march to Mordor and throw open the Black Gate. He settled in Greenwood, the great forest in the north of Middle-earth, and he built his fortress of Dol Guldur among the trees. And from there he began, very quietly, to corrupt the land around him. Watch what happened to the forest. Greenwood the Great, a name that speaks of beauty and life and the deep green health of the wild, slowly became Mirkwood. Not overnight, not through a dramatic act of destruction. Through the slow, creeping spread of shadow, spiders breeding in the dark places, strange sicknesses falling on the trees, the light growing dimmer beneath the canopy, the paths becoming dangerous, the creatures becoming hostile. Year by year, decade by decade, the forest sickened, darkened, turned from a place of life into a place of dread. And Sauron, sitting in the heart of it, fed on that corruption and grew stronger from it. This is how Sauron works at his most characteristic. Not the dramatic blow, not the thunderclap of conquest, but the slow corruption. The quiet poisoning of a healthy thing, the gradual turning of good into evil, the patient transformation of the world around him into something that reflects and serves his will. Greenwood did not fall to an army. It fell to a shadow, an influence, a sickness that crept through it like rot through a beam, invisible until the whole structure was compromised. And by the time the wise realized what was happening, by the time Gandalf entered Dol Guldur and confirmed that the shadow was Sauron, the forest was already deeply corrupted, and the damage would take generations to heal, if it could be healed at all. This is the kind of evil that Tolkien understood with particular clarity, not the evil that announces itself, but the evil that infiltrates, that poisons quietly, that turns good things bad so gradually that no one notices until the transformation is complete. Sauron in Dol Guldur is not a military threat. He is an environmental disaster, a moral pollution, a corruption that spreads outward from its source and taints everything it touches. And this is, I think, the truest portrait of his evil, not the Dark Tower and the Flaming Eye, which are dramatic but simple, but the slow sickening of a forest, the quiet transformation of Greenwood into Mirkwood, the patient, invisible, devastating work of a will that corrupts everything it comes near. Part 34. The Contest with the White Council. Sauron's time in Dol Guldur also reveals something about his relationship with the other great powers of Middle-earth, and about the way he used their own divisions and failures against them, playing the long game with his characteristic patience, even when his positions seemed weak. The White Council, the gathering of the wise, led by Saruman the White and including Gandalf, Galadriel, Elrond, and the other great elven lords, was formed specifically to counter the threat of Sauron's return. They knew, or suspected, that the shadow in Dol Guldur was the Dark Lord. Gandalf urged them, more than once, to attack Dol Guldur and drive Sauron out before he grew too strong. But Saruman, the head of the Order of Wizards, who was already being drawn toward his own corruption, delayed. He counseled patience. He argued that the time was not right, that more study was needed, that they should wait and watch. And Sauron, from his dark fortress, watched them watching him, and waited for them to do nothing. Because he understood, with the cold, accurate insight of a being who had spent ages studying the weaknesses of others, that the greatest threat to any council is the council itself. As long as the White Council debated and delayed and failed to act, Sauron was safe. Their divisions were his shield. Their caution was his protection. The very wisdom that should have warned them to strike quickly became, through Saruman's manipulations and through the natural tendency of councils to be cautious, the instrument of their inaction. When the White Council finally did attack Dol Guldur, driving Sauron out, it was already too late to prevent what he had been building toward. Sauron withdrew, not in defeat but according to plan, having already prepared his return to Mordor, having already laid the groundwork for his final bid for power. The assault on Dol Guldur felt like a victory for the White Council. But in truth, Sauron had already accomplished what he needed to accomplish there. The slow corruption of the forest, the rebuilding of his Nazgul, the long patient gathering of strength. He withdrew because he was ready to move to the next phase, not because the council had caught him unprepared. This is Sauron at his most devious. The villain who lets his enemies think they are winning, who uses their own institutions against them, who plays the game so many moves ahead that even his apparent defeats are actually strategic advances. The White Council's assault on Dol Guldur was not a failure of the wise in the simple sense. It was a demonstration of how difficult it is to fight an enemy who is always thinking further ahead than you are, who is always adapting, always adjusting, always 3 steps ahead of your 3 steps ahead. Sauron's patience was not just endurance, it was strategy. Every year the White Council delayed was a year he used. Every debate they had was time he spent building. He weaponized their own processes against them, and when they finally moved, they found that the board had already shifted beneath their feet. Part 35. The thing that Morgoth broke in him. I want to return, near the end, to the question of what Morgoth actually did to Mairon, because I think there is a dimension of their relationship that is easy to miss, and that deepens our understanding of Sauron's tragedy in a way that is both uncomfortable and important. Morgoth did not simply recruit Mairon. He changed him. Not through force, perhaps, not through the crude breaking of the will that Morgoth used on lesser creatures, through something subtler and more devastating, through the modeling of a worldview, the demonstration of a method, the shaping of a young and impressionable spirit's understanding of how power works and what it is for. Morgoth was Mairon's mentor, his teacher, his model of what a great being looks like. And what Mairon learned from Morgoth, what soaked into him across the long ages of service, was a set of assumptions about the world that he would never fully shake. The most important of these assumptions was this, that the world is fundamentally a field of competing wills, and that the strongest will deserves to prevail. Morgoth believed this. He acted on it. He lived it, in his every action and his every choice. And Mairon, watching him, serving him, absorbing his worldview, came to believe it too. Came to see the world not as a cooperative enterprise of free beings working together, but as a contest of wills in which the strongest should dominate and the weakest should serve. This is the thing Morgoth broke in Mairon. Not his intelligence. That remained intact. Not his gifts. Those were perverted, but not destroyed. What Morgoth broke was Mairon's moral imagination, his ability to conceive of a world that is not organized by domination. Before Morgoth, Mairon might still have chosen the patient way, the cooperative way, the way of the Valar. After millennia in Morgoth's service, that possibility was effectively closed. The habit of domination had become so deep, so ingrained, so woven into his way of thinking, that it was no longer a choice he was making. It was simply how he saw the world. He could not imagine anything else, could not imagine relationships that were not hierarchies, could not imagine cooperation that was not domination in disguise, could not imagine a world in which beings chose freely, and the result was good rather than chaotic. This is what service to evil does to the servant. It does not just use you, it remakes you. It teaches you to see the world through its eyes, to think in its categories, to want what it wants. By the time Mairon emerged from Morgoth's service at the end of the First Age, he was no longer a spirit who had chosen evil. He was a spirit who could no longer conceive of choosing otherwise. Morgoth had not just corrupted him. He had educated him, given him a complete worldview, a whole way of seeing and understanding that made evil seem like the only rational option. And that education, that remaking of Mairon's basic categories of thought, was the truest and most lasting damage Morgoth ever did to anyone. The Dark Lord's greatest creation was not any dragon or Balrog. It was Sauron, the student who absorbed the Master's worldview so completely that he carried it on, refined and perfected, long after the Master was gone. Part 36. The fear beneath the will. For all his vast power and his cold intelligence, there was a fear running beneath Sauron's will. A fear that drove his actions as much as his ambition did, that shaped his choices as profoundly as his love of order. And that fear was this: the fear of being judged, of being seen truly, of being known for what he was. Look at how Sauron operates throughout his career. He hides. He works in secret. He wears disguises. He builds his power in the shadows, in the gaps, in the places where the wise are not looking. Even at the height of his power, when he holds the One Ring and commands the armies of Mordor, he does not show himself openly. He remains behind his walls, in his tower, behind his eye, searching the world, watching everything, but never letting himself be seen in return. Why? A being of Sauron's power and pride should not need to hide. Morgoth did not hide. Morgoth challenged the Valar to their faces, built his fortress openly, waged his wars in the full light of the world. But Sauron hides, always, constantly, reflexively, and I think the reason is fear. Not the fear of defeat. Sauron has been defeated before and always come back. The fear of something worse, the fear of being known, of being understood, of having the lie he tells himself exposed. Because if the lie falls, if Sauron is seen truly, not as the Lord of Order and the necessary master, but as what he actually is, a corrupted spirit, a wasted potential, a being who threw away everything admirable about himself in pursuit of a domination that has produced nothing but ruin, then there is nothing left, no justification, no story in which he is the hero. Just the bare, devastating truth of a brilliant spirit who made a catastrophic mistake thousands of years ago and has been compounding it ever since, building an ever larger structure of evil to avoid confronting the simple fact that he was wrong, that he has always been wrong, that the order he sought was never worth the freedom it destroyed, that the world he wanted to perfect would have been better, infinitely better, left to its own messy, imperfect, glorious freedom. That is the fear that drives Sauron into his tower, behind his eye, deeper and deeper into the fortress of his own will. He cannot face the truth about himself, and so he hides from it, behind power, behind domination, behind the vast apparatus of his dark kingdom, behind the eye that searches the world but never turns its gaze inward. The Dark Lord of Mordor, who watches everything, is afraid to look at himself. And that fear, running beneath all the strength and all the will and all the cold intelligence, is perhaps the saddest thing about him. The mark of the being who, somewhere very deep down, beneath all the corruption, knows that what he has become is not what he was meant to be. Part 37. The moment it could have been different. We spoke earlier of Sauron's chance at redemption at the end of the First Age, but I want to return to it one final time, because it is the moment that haunts the whole story, the single point at which everything could have changed, the door that stood open and that Sauron chose not to walk through. The Herald of the Valar offered him a chance to come back, to return to Valinor, to submit to judgment, to accept whatever penance was required, and to be healed. Not punished, healed, the Valar were not offering Sauron retribution. They were offering him restoration. The chance to become again what he had been before Melkor twisted him, to recover the spirit of Mairon and leave behind the corruption of Sauron. Imagine what that restoration might have looked like: a spirit of immense craft and intelligence, freed from the will to dominate, returned to its original love of order and beauty, given a second chance to use its gifts as they were meant to be used. Mairon restored. The admirable one, admirable again, his enormous talents redirected toward making and enriching and healing, rather than dominating and destroying. The waste undone. The fall reversed. The tragedy turned, at the last possible moment, into a story of grace. But Sauron said no. He chose the dark road. He chose pride over humility, autonomy over submission, the familiar corruption over the terrifying prospect of becoming something new, or rather something old, something original, something he had not been for so long that he could hardly remember what it felt like. He chose to remain Sauron because becoming Myron again would have required a surrender of his self-image that was more frightening to him than all the armies of the Valar. And here is what makes that moment so haunting. It was real. The offer was genuine. Redemption was available. Sauron was not trapped, not doomed, not beyond saving, not yet, not at that moment. The door was open. All he had to do was walk through it. And he could not because the door was locked, but because walking through it would have required him to admit that everything he had done for the last several thousand years was wrong, that his master had been wrong, that his vision of the world had been wrong, that the order he had killed and enslaved and deceived to achieve was not worth a single one of the lives it had cost. That admission was the price of redemption. And Sauron could not pay it. Every tragedy has a moment like this, a moment when it could have been different, when the fall could have been arrested, when the story could have turned. And Sauron's moment is the most poignant of all, because the thing that stopped him was not some external barrier, but his own character, his own pride, his own inability to bear the weight of the truth about himself. He was his own prison. He locked himself in, and he threw away the key, and the door that could have let him out was never locked from the outside. It was only ever locked from within. Part 38. The Shadow and the Music. There is a tradition in Tolkien's lore, spoken of rarely but with tremendous weight, that at the end of all things, at the end of the world itself, there will be a second music, a music greater than the first, in which all the children of Ilúvatar, all the beings who have lived and struggled and suffered and loved across all the ages of the world, will sing together. And in that second music, every theme of the great song will be resolved, every discord healed, every sorrow redeemed, every loss transformed into a beauty greater than what was lost. Even, perhaps, the discord of Morgoth, the rebellion that marred the first music, will be taken up and woven into a final harmony so vast and so beautiful that even the evil will have served, in the end, to make the music richer. And the question that hangs over Sauron's story, the question that Tolkien leaves unanswered, because perhaps it cannot be answered within the bounds of the tale, is this: will Sauron's discord be redeemed in that final music? Will the fall of Myron, the tragedy of a brilliant spirit who turned his gifts to evil and became the Dark Lord of Middle-earth, will even that be woven into the final harmony? Will there be, somewhere in the vast resolution of all things, a note that was once Sauron's, once Myron's, carried forward and transformed and made part of the greater song? We cannot know. Tolkien does not tell us. The second music is a hope, a promise, a faith written into the structure of his world, but it is not a certainty, at least not from the perspective of those who dwell within the story. The characters of Middle-earth do not know how it ends. They live in the tension between hope and fear, between the faith that the song is going somewhere good and the knowledge that evil is real and that its damage is catastrophic. They cannot be certain that everything will be redeemed. They can only hope. But even the hope matters. Even the possibility that the discord could be resolved, that the fall could be transformed, that the waste of Sauron's gifts could somehow, in a music greater than anyone can imagine, be turned into something beautiful, even that possibility gives the tragedy a different weight. It does not erase the evil. It does not make the fall acceptable. It does not undo the damage. But it suggests that the story is not finished, that the final word has not been spoken, that the music is still playing, and that even the darkest notes may yet find their place in the harmony to come. And if that is true, if there is a second music, if the discord will be resolved, if even Sauron's fall will be woven into the final beauty, then the whole terrible story of how Sauron became the Dark Lord is, at its deepest level, a story about the cost of discord. The immense, grievous, almost unbearable cost of a spirit that chose to sing out of tune, that wove its own theme into the music of creation and warped everything it touched. The cost was real. The suffering was real. The tragedy was real. But the music goes on, and the hope, the fragile, impossible, stubborn hope, is that even this discord, even this, will find its resolution in the end. Part 39. The Name He Lost. Let us end where we began, with a name. Mairon the Admirable. A name given in love, in recognition, in admiration of a spirit whose gifts were extraordinary and whose potential was vast. A name that no one calls him anymore, because the being it described no longer exists, because that being was slowly, methodically, choice by choice, transformed into something that the name could no longer contain. Sauron. The Abhorred. The name his enemies gave him, the name that replaced the one he was born with, the name that tells the truth of what he became. From the admirable to the abhorred, that is the whole arc of his story, compressed into two names, and the distance between them is the distance of the greatest fall in all of Middle-earth after the fall of Morgoth himself. And between those two names lies the whole long tragedy we have traced tonight. The love of order that became the will to dominate, the brilliant spirit that became the tyrant, the maker who became the master, the servant of all who became the servant of Morgoth, and then the Lord of Mordor. Every step of that journey carried Mairon further from the name he was given and closer to the name his enemies would give him. And by the end, the journey was so complete, the transformation so total, that there was nothing left of Mairon at all. Just Sauron. Just the Dark Lord. Just the eye and the will and the hunger for control, and the vast, empty, burning need to dominate everything it touched. The name he lost is the measure of his fall. Because a name, in Tolkien's world, is not just a label. It is a truth, a statement of nature, a declaration of what a being is at its core. And the journey from Mairon to Sauron is the journey of a being whose core nature was transformed, not by some external force, not by some curse or spell or divine punishment, but by his own choices, his own decisions, his own repeated turning away from the good he could have been, and toward the evil he chose to become. He was not made into the Dark Lord by anyone else. He made himself into the Dark Lord, one choice at a time, across thousands of years, until the admirable spirit was buried so deep beneath the layers of corruption that no name anyone spoke could reach it anymore. Part 40. The story that never ends. And so the story of how Sauron became the Dark Lord reaches its end, or rather, it reaches the place where we must stop. Because the story itself, in a sense, never quite ends. Sauron was not destroyed when the ring went into the fire. He was diminished beyond recovery, reduced to a formless whisper, unable ever to act upon the world again. But the malice that was his essence lingered, a shadow without form, a will without power, a memory of evil that had no strength left to do evil, but that had not ceased entirely to exist. And this is the final truth about the Dark Lord, the truth that makes his story endure. Evil is not always dramatic, not always spectacular, not always the great shadow over the land and the armies at the gate. Sometimes evil is simply a whisper, a lingering corruption, a quiet poison, a habit of thought that persists long after the power to act on it has been broken. Sauron's physical power was destroyed. His ring was unmade. His tower fell. But the kind of evil he represented, the will to dominate, the hunger for control, the conviction that order imposed by force is better than freedom's messy imperfection, that kind of evil is never fully destroyed, because it is not just one being's choice. It is a temptation woven into the fabric of the world, available to anyone, at any time in any age. This is why Sauron's story matters, not just as a tale of a fallen spirit, not just as a villain's origin story, not just as a chapter in the history of an invented world, but as a warning and a mirror, held up to our own world and our own temptations. The path from Mairon to Sauron is a path that any of us might walk, in small ways, in everyday choices, whenever we let our love of the way things should be become a justification for imposing our will on the way things are. whenever we sacrifice someone else's freedom for our own vision of order, whenever we tell ourselves that the ends justify the means, that we know best, that the chaos must be tamed, even if the taming costs others their right to choose. The distance from Myron to Sauron is not a gulf. It is a slope, and we all stand on it, every day. So remember the name he lost. Remember Myron, the admirable, the spirit who loved order and beauty and the perfecting of things. Remember what he could have been, and remember what he became. And remember that the distance between those two things was measured not in some vast cosmic catastrophe, but in a long series of small, reasonable, defensible choices that each carried him a little further from the light. Remember the moment of redemption that was offered and refused, the door that stood open and was not walked through. Remember the lie he told himself, that order justified any means, that domination was service, that his vision of the world was so important that the freedom of others could be sacrificed to achieve it. And then look at your own life, at your own world, at the places where you are tempted to impose rather than to cooperate, to control rather than to trust, to demand perfection at the expense of freedom. Because Sauron's story is not just the story of a Dark Lord in a fantasy world. It is the story of every time, in every age, in every life, that the love of order crosses the line into the will to dominate. And the answer to that temptation, the one thing that can stop the slide from Myron to Sauron, is the same thing that defeated the Dark Lord in the end. Not force, not power, not a greater domination to overthrow the lesser. Mercy, humility, the willingness to let go, the courage to trust freedom, even when freedom stumbles. The choice, made again and again, to serve rather than to rule, to open the hand rather than to close the fist. That is how Sauron became the Dark Lord. And that, in the end, is how he was defeated, by the small, the humble, the merciful, and the free. May we remember both parts of the story. May we be warned by the fall, and may we be saved, when our turn comes, by the same grace that defeated him. Thank you for walking this long, dark road with me tonight. The tale of Mehron is, I think, one of the most important stories Tolkien ever told, and one of the most important stories anyone ever told, about the slow, quiet, terrible ease with which the best of intentions can become the worst of outcomes. Remember the admirable one. Remember what he lost, and may we all, in our own small ways, choose differently when the moment comes. The world is messy and imperfect and free, and that is good. Let it be. And remember Mehron. Remember the bright spirit who loved making and beauty and the way things fit together, who could have been one of the great benefactors of creation, who could have spent the ages enriching the world instead of imprisoning it. Remember him not because he deserves pity. He made his choices, and his choices were his own. But because remembering what he was before the fall is the only way to fully understand what was lost when the fall was complete. The tragedy of Sauron is not just the evil he did. It is the good he could have done and never will, the magnificence that was wasted, the gifts that should have blessed the world and instead cursed it. The admirable became the abhorred, the maker became the master, the lover of order became the builder of prisons, and somewhere, in the formless whisper that is all that remains of him after the ring went into the fire, the spirit that was once Myron endures, not as a threat, not as a power, not as anything the world need fear, but as a memory and a warning, carried forward by everyone who has ever heard the tale. Let it be enough. Let the warning be heard. And let the music play on.